This girl was about to go to the bathroom when she bumped into a chair leg and fell. Immediately after that, she screamed loudly, scaring all the servants and housekeepers. When they were all gathered, the girl made each maid blindfolded. Then one by one, they went to the chair and tripped over it to relieve her anger. This arrogant girl is Yun Son. She used to be a beautiful ballet dancer, but now she is blind. Not long ago, during a performance, an accident happened and took away the light of her life forever. At that time, a scene of professional ballet dancers appeared on the stage. The artists were performing passionately to melodious music. At that time, Yun Son saw herself performing with her colleagues. Suddenly, something fell on her, causing her to be injured and bleeding. Back in the present, the housekeeper named Sung Hwan ran to Yun Son and asked her what she was doing. Yun Son said that she wanted the maids to understand her feelings, the feelings of someone who couldn't see and could get hurt at any moment. Then Yun Son stood up with a white cane for the blind. She asked who left the chair there and caused her to fall, but no one would admit their mistakes, so Yun Son angrily asked to fire them all. Finally, one maid confessed her crime. Yun Son already knew that the culprit was that girl. Because Yun Son smelled cheap lavender near the chair, the maid panicked and admitted her mistake and explained that while cleaning old clothes, she had accidentally left chair there. However, Yun Son didn't care about the reason and immediately ordered the girl to be fired. Then, Yun Son and Sung Hwan were sitting in the dressing room when another woman named Yumi suddenly entered. Yun Son asked Yumi to stay at her house, but Yumi refused because she didn't want to see Yun Son day and night. Then Yumi gave Yun Son a stack of letters from other people. Among the 5 letters, there was a letter from the Fantasia Cultural Foundation. Sung Hwan tried to hide it so Yun Son wouldn't read it, but she quickly snatched it back. Yun Son realized that the envelope had braille for the visually impaired. After Yun Son touched and read it, she discovered that it was an invitation to the Fantasia Foundation's 20th anniversary party. Yun Son knew that the event would take place tomorrow. Right after that, Yun Son changed into her gym clothes and went out. She was accompanied by her guide dog named Guzem. During this time, Sung Hwan received a call from Yun Son's doctor. The doctor informed her that the results of the cornea donor search were out. As soon as she got to Sung Hwan, Yun Son took the phone from him and wanted to know the results. All the previous times had been disappointing news. This time, the results still disappointed her. She didn't want to hear any more reasons, so Yun Son asked to remove her name from the cornea transplant list. After saying that, she left with her pet dog. In fact, after the accident on stage, Yun Son was very upset and didn't want anyone to mention ballet in front of her, just like she didn't want to hear about Fantasia. In another development, this guy was sitting on the top floor of a building. Before leaving, he said goodbye to the sky, then spread his arms and jumped down. Suddenly, when he fell, 2 white wings appeared from both sides of his shoulders. It turned out that his name was Dan. He was an angel sent to the human world to help people. Immediately after that, Dan used his hand to disappear. In the blink of an eye, he was in a truck full of dogs. The driver was preparing to take them to slaughter. At this moment, he was about to light a cigarette, but Dan used magic to prevent the lighter from igniting. Not stopping there, he also made the lighter float in the air, surprising the driver and causing him to lose control of the wheel. Taking advantage of that opportunity, Dan immediately freed all the dogs locked in the cage. Among them, there was a dog that was barely alive. Seeing that, Dan used magic to help the dog's soul to be released gently. In another place, Yun Son was jogging with her dog. When they realized that Yun Son was blind, they deliberately had the intention of harassing her. At that moment, Dan passed by and intended to help her. However, what happened before his eyes made him unable to believe his eyes. 2 young men tried to molest Yun Son, but she quickly used a stick to fight back. Yun Son hit them so hard that they were scared and had to run away in panic. Then Dan quietly followed Yun Son to the bridge. This was also the place where she almost died. Here, Yun Son remembered what the 2 young men said earlier. They said that she was useless. Those words made Yun Son extremely sad. Sad memories flooded back. She remembered the time she tried to do ballet on the bridge while she was blind, but it was inherently impossible, so it made her lose her balance and fall off the bridge. While Yun Son was immersed in pain, Dan approached her and whispered that she was stupid. Surprisingly, Yun Son completely heard what Dan said. A moment later, Yun Son sat on the bench and enjoyed the wind carrying falling flower petals with the dog. Dan then approached and sat next to Yun Son. When the wind stopped, Yun Son asked who he was. However, Dan did not answer. He only said that she probably could not hear anything. Surprisingly, Yun Son said that she heard him very clearly. Yun Son also confirmed that Dan was a man, which stunned him. Dan did not understand how Yun Son could hear the words of an angel. Yun Son thought that Dan was being rude to her because she was blind. Then the 2 started arguing. During the argument, Yun Son said something that shocked Dan. Dan was surprised when he realized that Yun Son could touch him. She thought that he was someone sent to harass her. At that moment, Dan saw someone approaching, so he immediately used magic and disappeared. Then Yumi ran to Yeonseon because she saw Yeonseon panicking alone. During this time, Yeonseon accidentally picked up the handkerchief that Dan dropped when he disappeared. At the same time, Sewon went to Fantasia's event organization headquarters and met Yeonseon's aunt, Youngja. Youngja did not want Yeonseon to run Fantasia, an organization founded by Yeonseon. Sungwon thought that Yeonseon's failure to find a suitable cornea for the past 3 years was Youngja's plot, keep her position as Fantasia's CEO. Sungwon even threatened Youngja that he would report to the police to investigate Yeonseon's cornea transplant case. That statement made Youngja uneasy. Youngja then went to see Dr. Kim, who was responsible for finding Yeonseon's cornea. Youngja asked him to keep it a secret until the end, absolutely not to reveal that she was the mastermind under any circumstances. Meanwhile, Dan was still thinking about Yeonseon being able to see and hear him when he suddenly saw a car stop. Then someone threw a cat's body onto the street. Dan immediately went to free its soul. Immediately after that, Dan's uncle who was also an angel, suddenly appeared. Who told Dan not to cause more trouble for humans? Dan replied that he only wanted to help them and punish them when they did wrong. However, Who warned Dan to be careful and not to touch humans carelessly, or he would disappear like dust. Who also reminded Dan that his term was about to end, so he had to be more careful than ever. At this time, Dan realized that he had lost his handkerchief. It was an object used to prove his angelic identity. Dan remembered that he might have accidentally dropped it while confronting Yeonseon, and she picked it up. That night, Yeonseon had a nightmare, so Songhwan came to comfort her. Yeonseon said that she would not attend the Fantasia anniversary ceremony. Hearing that, Songhwan affirmed that no matter what happened, he would always stand by Yeonseon's side. When he recalled the memories between the two, he couldn't help but feel emotional. Outside the window, Dan was watching everything. Dan thought Yeonseon was being rude to her family. After Songhwan left, Dan approached Yeonseon to look for the handkerchief. He clearly saw it there, but he couldn't find a way to get it back. Meanwhile, Yumi said that she needed one of the maids to stay by Yeonseon's side because Songhwan had to go out to do some work the next day. However, no one dared to take on this job. Suddenly, Yeonseon came down the stairs with a gorgeous appearance, surprising everyone. Yeonseon decided to attend Fantasia's anniversary ceremony with Songhwan. When Yeonseon entered the hall, Youngja's family pretended to be happy when they saw her appear. To the amazement of the guests and the press, Songhwan was extremely worried about Yeonseon. At this time, Yeonseon wanted to go to the bathroom, so she told Songhwan to go first. When Yeonseon was about to leave the bathroom, she heard two dancers outside talking about her. They said that they didn't want Yeonseon to appear here because they were afraid that her presence would bring them bad luck. Soon after, the anniversary ceremony began with a ballet performance. Yeonseon didn't enter the hall. She just stood outside. She quietly listened to the music and danced along. When it was time for Yeonseon to speak, everyone couldn't find her anywhere. Suddenly, Yeonseon appeared with Songhwan and gave a speech that surprised everyone present. In her speech, Yeonseon claimed that Youngja's daughter Nina took advantage of her blindness to replace her as Fantasia's main dancer. After the ceremony, Youngja angrily pulled Yeonseon aside and asked why she ruined the celebration. Yeonseon replied that Youngja had intentionally held the company's anniversary on the anniversary of her parents' death. Not only that, Yeonseon also recalled how Youngja had laughed happily when she learned that Yeonseon had lost her sight. These words made Youngja extremely panic. Youngja was about to argue with Yeonseon, but Songhwan stopped her. Immediately after, Songhwan took Yeonseon away. In the car, Yeonseon and Songhwan had a conflict while talking. Suddenly, the car's brakes failed. It lost control and crashed into the median strip on the side of the road. In a critical moment, Songhwan remembered someone sneaking up on his car. After the collision, Songhwan and Yeonseon were unconscious. At this moment, Dan appeared nearby. At first, Dan intended to perform a spell to help their souls rest in peace. However, when Dan heard Yeonseon's cry for help, he began to hesitate because angels are absolutely not allowed to interfere with human life. In the end, Dan could not bear to leave Yeonseon alone, but that action meant that the door between the two worlds would close and he would not be able to return to heaven. Who blamed Dan for breaking the rules? This caused Dan to fall into his current situation. Soon after, a man named Kang Woo appeared at the scene. Kang Woo saw Yeonseon alive, so he saved her and took her to the emergency room. Meanwhile, Who brought a notice and told Dan that he had been expelled from his status as an angel. However, thanks to Dan's many times of saving animals, they were grateful and asked for a chance to return. Accordingly, Dan needed to carry out a special mission within 100 days. As a human, only when the mission is completed will the door between the two worlds open again, and then Dan can become an angel again. Dan is very excited when he hears that. Who says that Dan's mission is to love. Although Dan doesn't understand very well, he happily accepts the mission. Meanwhile, Yeonseon in the hospital has woken up. What's more miraculous is that Yeonseon's eyes have recovered and can see clearly like before. Yeonseon watches the sunset and remembers Songhwan, the person who always loved her has passed away, making her extremely sad. While Dan is happy that he has become human, Youngja's whole family is visiting Yeon-seon in the hospital. Seeing everyone wearing black, Yeon-seon is very curious. She guesses that they must have thought she wouldn't make it, so they dressed up like they were going to a funeral. Hearing her question, the whole family is a bit worried. Yeon-seon asks Youngja's whole family to bring Sen-hwan to see her, and she chases everyone out of the room. This makes Youngja mad. Youngja thinks Yeon-seon is too rude. Youngja's husband Ki-chon thinks his wife is too strict with Yeon-seon. Youngja's youngest daughter Nina wants to stay and take care of Yeon-seon, but Youngja stops her because Yeon-seon insulted Nina at the company's anniversary. But Nina is determined not to leave because she knows Yeon-seon is very sad because of Sung-hwan's departure. However, Nina's older sister Runa advises her to return so that Yeon-seon can have time to calm down. Meanwhile, Dan goes to the hospital where Yeon-seon is being treated to carry out a mission. He sees her coming out of the elevator in a hurry. Yeon-seon just wants to know if Sung-hwan is alive or dead. Dan quietly follows Yeon-seon to Sung-hwan's funeral. There, Yeon-seon is in pain when she hears people around her gossiping behind her back. They say that Sung-hwan was taken advantage of by Yeon-seon's family. He donated his corneas to her, and his death may be related to someone's murder. These words shocked Yeon-seon. Yumi then gave Yeon-seon a chrysanthemum to pay her respects to Sung-hwan. Yeon-seon felt like the sky was falling. She was tormented by the fact that she was late. Yeon-seon was like a madman. She cried and laughed at the same time, scaring everyone present. Then the nurse announced that Yeon-seon had been missing since she left the funeral. When the nurse mentioned room number 502, Dan was startled because this was also the number that appeared in his mission. After asking carefully, Dan knew that Yeon-seon was part of the mission. Meanwhile, Kang-woo went to the hospital to visit Yeon-seon, but he didn't see her. At this time, Yeon-seon took a taxi home. Here, Yeon-seon found the notes about her childhood that Sung-hwan kept. When she read them, she painfully screamed his name in despair. Dan immediately ran back to find Who. Dan couldn't believe that they gave him such a terrible mission. Dan thought of Yeon-seon laughing at the funeral of her cornea donor, so he was even more scared and thought she was not normal. Immediately after that, Dan earnestly asked Who to change his mission. That night, Dan slept outside the church door. In the morning, Who appeared in the form of a policeman and woke Dan up. Dan tried to convince her to change the mission. At that time, Who used magic to create a suit for Dan to wear and then disappeared. This surprised Dan very much. At this time, Yumi went to Yeon-seon's house and saw her lying on the floor. The floor was very messy with all kinds of photos. Yumi angrily scolded Yeon-seon. Yumi asked Yeon-seon to cherish the eyes that Sung-hwan donated to her. Yeon-seon said that she had never begged him. Hearing that, Yumi became even angrier. Yumi asked Yeon-seon to return the eyes to Sung-hwan. Yumi told Yeon-seon not to waste something precious from a respectable person like Sung-hwan. The two argued for a while. Yeon-seon suddenly becomes unable to walk. This causes both of them to panic. The doctor diagnoses that the reason Yeon-seon cannot walk may be due to psychological trauma after she suffered a great shock from losing a loved one. Meanwhile, Nina and her colleagues are practicing dance when Kang-woo suddenly walks in. Kang-woo points out Nina's mistakes when she dances ballet, surprising everyone. Everyone wonders who he is. Kang-woo immediately introduces himself as the newly appointed artistic director. Kang-woo asks Runa, the deputy artistic director, to gather everyone so he can work. Kang-woo then announces that everyone will have to practice another play to perform. Nina objects, saying that they have practiced Swan Lake too many times and they do not want to change. However, Kang-woo insists that Nina should practice more. At the same time, Kang-woo says that he wants Yeon-seon to be the female lead in the upcoming play. Nina is stunned by his words and everyone around them gossips. The director objected to Kang-woo's arbitrary change of plans. At that moment, Youngja walked in and greeted him. Youngja formally introduced Kang-woo to everyone. She asked him not to make decisions on his own like he had just done, and she especially didn't want him to mention Yeon-seon's name, but Kang-woo still insisted that he wanted Yeon-seon to act in the play he directed. This was difficult for both Youngja and Runa to accept. They thought that Yeon-seon was not capable of performing the play because she could only see it now. Kang-woo immediately brought up the contract terms to defend his point of view. At the same time, Kang-woo said that Youngja and Runa were Yeon-seon's relatives, so they should support her instead of opposing her. Kang-woo also said that Runa was afraid that her sister would lose her top position when Yeon-seon returned. Runa immediately denied it. Youngja demanded that Kang-woo take responsibility for his decision. Meanwhile, Dan went to Yeon-seon's house to interview for the housekeeper position that Sung-hwan used to hold. Dan saw that many people had also come to interview. Strangely, everyone who came out was the same. This made Dan confused about what was going on. Inside, Yumi was tired because Yeon-seon had rejected 20 people in just 3 hours. Yeon-seon thought that no one could replace Sung-hwan's position in her heart. Yumi advised Yeon-seon to be more open-minded minded. Yun-sun told Yumi to randomly recruit someone from the people working at the house. However, even though they had increased their salaries a lot, no one dared to apply because of Yun-sun's unpleasant personality. In the end, Yun-sun still asked Yumi to continue looking for a housekeeper. This left Yumi helpless. When Dan entered the interview, Yumi was extremely surprised that a young man like Dan wanted to apply for this position. Yumi was very happy with Dan's enthusiasm. Dan said that he would help Yun-sun shine. That statement reminded Yun-sun of Sung-won because he had told her the same thing. Dan tried to convince Yun-sun to hire him, but Yun-sun flatly refused, and she wanted Dan to leave. Dan angrily walked out. Dan did not forget to say that Yun-sun was a grumpy and mean person. Yumi and Yun-sun were both surprised when they saw Dan being so straightforward. Then Dan left. He was muttering as he walked. Yun-sun angrily chased after Dan. At that moment, both Yumi and Yun-sun were surprised when they realized that Yun-sun was able to walk again. Dan was thinking about whether he should go back and apologize to Yun-sun to get the job, when suddenly Yumi ran after him and said that he had been hired. That surprised Dan. Then Yumi took Dan to the butler's room, prepared the necessary items for the job, as well as provided information about Yun-sun. Dan felt very happy because he had gotten one step closer to Yun-sun. Yumi then goes to tell Yun-sun that Dan has been recruited. Yumi believes that Dan is the most suitable person to help Yun-sun forget her pain. However, Yun-sun completely disagrees with that. One night, while Dan was sleeping soundly, he heard the alarm sound. Dan jumped up in panic and ran to Yun-sun's room. Dan reached out to help Yun-sun stand up, but she refused. However, just a minute after she fell, she was forced to ask him for help to walk. Then she took him to the martial arts club and forced him to learn martial arts, with the reason that she did not want him to break his bones when she beat him. Dan was both in pain and did not understand why he had to learn this, but he still followed. During the observation, Dan realized that Yun-sun was an excessive perfectionist. She was too strict with everything around her. Yun-sun saw that the piano was not cleaned properly, so she fired the maid. She saw a strand of hair on the floor, so she forced them to clean it up. Not only that, Yun-sun also criticized the maids because they miscalculated the calories in the food. To change the atmosphere, Dan took Yun-sun to see the flowers, but all Yun-sun showed was hatred, and she even picked the flowers without feeling. Dan secretly recorded everything about Yun-sun in a notebook. Dan realized that the servants in the house did not like Yun-sun because of her erratic temperament. Although Dan knew it would be difficult, he was determined to make Yun-sun understand what love was. Meanwhile, Kang-woo passed by the gym and saw Nina practicing so hard that she twisted her ankle. He went over to help her ease the pain. However, he thought she was too stupid and hasty. Those words hurt her. Kang-woo then returned home and was hatching a plan. Meanwhile, Ki-chon thought that Young-ja should return everything to Yun-sun because they originally belonged to her. However, Young-ja did not agree because she did not want to return to the debt-ridden, miserable life of the past. At this time, Yun-sun gathered all the housekeepers. She wanted to know who had cleaned the garden but accidentally left a flower on the floor. It almost made her fall. However, no one dared to take the blame. Dan saw that Yun-sun was making things difficult for everyone, so he spoke up and admitted that he was the one who cleaned the garden, and he promised to clean it up. To make her happy, Dan also told everyone to return to their work positions. At the same time, Dan used the labor law to threaten Yun-sun, making her extremely angry. After that, Dan advised Yun-sun to find love to forget the pain that was in her heart, but she did not want to listen and left. That made him very upset. To ease the atmosphere, Kang-woo went to the bakery and bought some cake to bring back to Yun-sun. Meanwhile, Yun-sun wanted to call Dan to see her, but he was having trouble as he tried to control the angel wings to make them disappear before she found out. When Yun-sun went down to the living room, she suddenly saw a broken window. The scene reminded her of the accident while she was dancing ballet. She was scared and fell down. She then looked up at the ceiling and felt the lamp about to fall. Her legs suddenly couldn't stand up. When the lamp was about to fall on Yun-sun, Dan appeared in time with his angel wings and caught her, so she wouldn't get hurt. A memory suddenly appeared in Yun-sun's mind. When she was little, Yun-sun saw a boy about to be splashed with water, so she quickly ran to shield him. Back in the present, Dan worriedly asked if Yun-sun was okay. Then he carried her onto the sofa, making her blush. He thought she had a fever, so he tried to touch her forehead, but she avoided it. At this moment, she saw wings on his back. Dan was surprised. Dan thought he had been exposed as an angel, but Yun-sun thought that Dan was just a pervert wearing fake wings. She forced him to take off his wings in front of her, but Dan did not agree. Yun-sun immediately followed Dan. She held onto his wings tightly and refused to let go. This made Dan angry. He thought that she always looked down on others and was difficult. Then Dan left, leaving Yun-sun behind. In Dan's heart, he thought that all humans were the same. When Dan was about to return to his room, he suddenly saw Kang-woo entering the house. Dan thought Kang-woo was a bad guy, so he immediately rushed to knock Kang-woo down. Then Dan called Yun-sun and asked to call the police. Kang Woo struggled and asked Dan to let him go, but Dan refused. In the end, Dan was knocked down by Kang Woo. At that moment, Yeon-sun used a stick to hit Kang Woo. Immediately after that, Kang Woo introduced himself as the new art director of Fantasia. Kang Woo looked around the living room and thought that something unusual had just happened here, so he wanted to call the police. However, Yeon-sun stopped him in time. She insisted that this was her house, and so she had full authority to decide. Yeon-sun asked Kang Woo not to interfere. Kang Woo thought that Yeon-sun was afraid of something, but in fact, she just didn't want to get into trouble. At this time, Yeon-sun thought that Kang Woo's leaving was helping her. Dan then asked Kang Woo to leave, but Kang Woo wanted Dan to apologize to him. However, Dan provoked Kang Woo, making him upset. Kang Woo thought that the broken window might have been caused by someone sneaking in through the window, and he suspected that Dan was the one who caused this. Yeon-sun immediately asked Kang Woo not to reveal this to anyone, especially to the people at Fantasia. In the end, Kang Woo had no choice but to leave helplessly. Soon after, Yeon-sun returned to her room and thought about what had just happened, making her tired. Meanwhile, Dan was worried about his injured foot. Yeon-sun was about to bring the first aid kit to Dan, but she was surprised to see him standing in front of her room door. At this time, he had prepared a cup of chrysanthemum tea. He thought she was very scared of what happened earlier, so he wanted to make tea to help her sleep. Yeon-sun denied that she was scared, but Dan thought she was lying. When he gave her the cup of tea, she quickly took it and closed the door. Dan said that he would stay in front of the door in case of any unexpected incidents. Then Yeon-sun also gave Dan medicine to treat the wound, and she immediately closed the door. In the end, she drank the tea he made. He used the medicine she had just given him. At this time, Kang Woo sent someone to investigate Dan's information. On the way, Kang Woo felt that someone was following him. Kang Woo discovered that the person was Nina. Nina immediately said that she was on her way to buy bread and coincidentally met Kang Woo. When Kang Woo heard that, he asked Nina to have dinner with him. When they both went to eat noodles, Kang Woo still suspected that Nina was following him, but she thought that he was too suspicious and did not trust anyone. Nina affirmed that not everyone was as evil as he thought. At the same time, she wanted to be someone he could trust. Kang Woo thought that Nina was too naive compared to Yeon-sun. At this time, Nina expressed her admiration for Yeon-sun. Nina was willing to be Yeon-sun's stand-in. At first, Kang Woo thought that Nina came just to complain about not being the main dancer. Then Nina asked to go to the bathroom. It turned out that she went there to try to throw up the food she had just eaten. She did it to keep her figure. Kang Woo knew this and left angrily. Nina followed after her. She promised that she would not do it again. Kang Woo did not want Nina to have anorexia because it could affect her career. Hearing this, Nina begged Kang Woo to keep this a secret. Kang Woo told Nina to be selfish and put herself first. The next morning, Yeon-sun, Yumi, and Dan summoned the people in charge of engineering and maintenance in the house to ask for information. Yeon-sun suspected that someone was trying to harm her, but Dan thought it was just an accident. Yeon-sun immediately threatened them. She asked them to confess or she would take legal action. Finally, one of them couldn't stand her bad personality, so they quit their jobs and left. Yeon-sun then asked Yumi to review all the video footage from the camera in the past 3 days. At this time, Dan felt restless and worried. He was afraid that people would find out that he was an angel. The three of them reviewed the footage from the day of the incident, but luckily, the footage was damaged, so they couldn't find anything. Meanwhile, Who had transformed into a bodyguard. It was Who helped Dan avoid revealing his identity. Who also scolded Dan for not being careful. Suddenly, Kang Woo appeared and wanted to see Yeon-sun. At this time, Yeon-sun told Yumi to have all the servants in the house sign a confidentiality agreement about what happened. Soon after, and Yumi were surprised when they saw Kang Woo barging into their house with a policeman. He said that he would ask the police to investigate. This made Yeon-sun upset. The police thought that since the scene had been cleaned up, it meant that someone was trying to hide something. However, because there was no video recording, it was difficult for them to find the culprit. In the end, the police had to leave. Then Yeon-sun asked Dan to take her somewhere and asked Kang Woo to leave because he was bothering them. But Dan didn't know how to drive, so Yeon-sun asked Kang Woo to take them. When they arrived, Yeon-sun and Dan visited her parents and Sungwon's resting place. Yeon-sun was sad that they had left her. At the same time, she was worried because she always felt like someone wanted to harm her. Dan saw Yeon-sun crying and he began to have faith in her. He thought that she could still love someone, but she thought that he was trying to please her. So he said those words, but Dan was determined to help Yeon-sun. Yeon-sun thought Dan was crazy. At that moment, it suddenly started to rain. Dan quickly went to get an umbrella because he was afraid that his wings would be exposed when it rained. At the same time, Kang Woo got out of the car and held an umbrella for Yeon-sun. He wanted to take her, but she wanted to wait for Dan to go together. This surprised Kang Woo about their relationship. While waiting, Kang Woo showed Yeon-sun a video and told her a story. He suddenly confessed to her, which surprised her. Kang Woo started started to feel uncomfortable because Dan had been getting the umbrella since it started raining until it stopped. On the way back, the car encountered an obstacle, forcing Kanwoo to steer to avoid it. That turn scared Yeon-seon and reminded her of the previous car accident. Kanwoo immediately held Yeon-seon's hand to comfort her and then gave her the necklace he had picked up on the day of the accident. At this moment, Yeon-seon realized that the person who saved her that day was Kang-woo. Dan stood by in amazement as he thought Kang-woo might be Yeon-seon's destiny. After returning, Kang-woo gave both of them cakes. Meanwhile, Ki-chun made an appointment to meet a man. He was the doctor in charge of finding Yeon-seon's cornea. Ki-chun was heartbroken when he learned that his wife had deliberately hindered the search for Yeon-seon's cornea. She even ordered the doctor to destroy Sung-hwan's car with its broken brakes. Ki-chun then returned to his wife's office. He overheard her conversation with the technician who used to work at Yeon-seon's house. Today, she was very upset because he couldn't do the job she asked him to do. That made Ki-chun more depressed than ever. Meanwhile, Yeon-seon went to Sung-hwan's room and remembered what Kang-woo had said to her. He wanted her to return to ballet and shine on stage again. At the same time, Kang-woo still couldn't find any information about Dan, but Kang-woo hoped that Yeon-seon could be happy like before. At this time, Dan was having a headache thinking about what he should do next because his time was limited. At this time, Ki-chun told the whole family that they were too strict with Yeon-seon and he wanted everyone to love her more because they were a family after all. The next morning, Yeon-seon went to look for the dog and she was shocked to see it lying next to Dan, gasping for breath. There were lots of pieces of chocolate cake around. Dan was equally worried. The doctor said that she absolutely should not feed the dog chocolate because the dog was Yeon-seon's only remaining relative. If something happened to the dog, she would completely collapse. At this time, Dan felt extremely guilty towards her because he fed the dog cake. After that, they returned home together. The two were surprised to see Ki-chun and Nina holding a party for Yeon-seon. Nina also recorded Yeon-seon and posted it online, making her extremely upset. Meanwhile, Young-ja sneaks into Sung-hwan's room using the key the technician gave her. Young-ja can break into the room and rummage around looking for something. When Yeon-seon knows that someone is in Sung-hwan's room, she rushes upstairs, but Young-ja quickly leaves the room first. Yeon-seon gets angry and chases Young-ja's whole family out. They hold a party to celebrate Yeon-seon's recovery, but to her, it's ridiculous. Yeon-seon thinks that she has no reason to be happy since she received a cornea from a dead man. Nina expresses her concern for Yeon-seon, but Yeon-seon thinks that Nina is just afraid that she will take away Nina's current position. Yeon-seon asks them to leave before anything unexpected happens. Dan thinks that Yeon-seon shouldn't be rude to her family, but she gets angry because he doesn't know what they did to her, and yet he speaks carelessly. Because of that, the two have a fierce argument. They even threw cakes at each other and pulled each other's hair. Dan finally gave in to Yeon-seon's temper. After Dan left, he received a call from Yumi. She invited him to drink and advised him to be patient with Yeon-seon this time. While Yeon-seon was about to call Dan, she caught him in the yard drunk. He was making a scene and talking nonsense. He confessed that he was worried that she might trip and fall, so he cleaned up everything in the yard. Dan apologized and hoped that Yeon-seon would try to live well and shine with her dance moves, even when she wasn't with him. Seeing Yeon-seon's injured hand, Dan used his towel to bandage it. Then he even wanted to dance with her. This surprised Yeon-seon. After that, they danced together, making her extremely happy. Dan complimented Yeon-seon on her beauty while dancing, then he collapsed on her shoulder. The next morning, Dan woke up on the swing in Yeon-seon's yard. He had a headache and remembered what he did with her last night, but before he could understand what was happening, he saw a lot of police officers coming to arrest him. Dan wanted to explain to Yeon-seon that he did nothing wrong. It was all a misunderstanding. However, Yeon-seon realized that Dan had lied. Yeon-seon remembered that when she was blind, she and Dan had met. At that time, she thought he was a pervert. Yeon-seon only knew for sure last night. At that time, she recognized the handkerchief he gave her. It was the thing that proved they had met. Dan had to admit that he had lied and said that someone else had brought him to her house. Yeon-seon was angry and let the police take Dan away. At the police station, Dan tried to convince the police that he was innocent, but no one believed him. During this time, Yeon-seon cleaned out Dan's things. Yumi felt heartbroken and thought that Dan had told Yeon-seon everything, so he was kicked out, but Yumi was sure that Dan had a reason for doing so. However, Yeon-seon did not trust anyone easily. The only person Yeon-seon still trusts is Yumi, because Yeon-seon thinks that Yumi is the only one who doesn't follow anyone or pretend to love her. Yumi tries every way to convince Yeon-seon to let Dan come back. Yumi doesn't think that someone who loves chocolate, eagerly waits for Yeon-seon's birthday, and cares about everything about Yeon-seon could harm her. Yumi believes that Dan did that because he loved Yeon-seon at first sight. So Dan tries to approach Yeon-seon. However, Yeon-seon still doesn't agree to let Dan come back. Then Dan somehow goes to the church. Dan tries to go inside, but Who doesn't let him in. Who says that Dan is only allowed to go in when he completes the mission. But at this time, Dan just wants to change missions. At this time, Dan has no money. He is so hungry that he can only stand and watch the children eating delicious sausages. Dan accidentally hears the conversation between two women. They used to be Yeon-sun's colleagues. They think Yeon-sun is selfish and evil because she used the cornea of a deceased person but was ungrateful and did not appreciate it. All of these rumors originated from the live broadcast that Nina filmed the day of Yeon-sun's celebration party. Meanwhile, the dancers were discussing Yeon-sun's situation when Kang-woo walked in. He asked everyone to practice hard for the upcoming performance. The dancers wanted to know when Yeon-sun would come to practice because the performance day was near and the female lead had not appeared yet. Kang-woo assured that Yeon-sun would participate. At the same time, he asked everyone to focus on their own performance. Kang-woo asked them not to interfere with his decision. Kang-woo then angrily went to see Runa because she changed her practice routine without permission. Runa did not care and asked him to attend the board meeting. At the meeting, the board members discussed that they would not allow Yeon-sun to return to ballet. However, Kang-woo was sure that he would bring Yeon-sun to the stage to perform in front of everyone's admiring eyes for her talent. At the same time, he held a press conference to announce Yeon-sun's return to the media. Immediately after that, Runa ran after Kang-woo and wanted him to stop what he was going to do to Yeon-sun, but he firmly refused. Runa took the video of Yeon-sun to threaten Kang-woo. However, Kang-woo quickly caught the person who released the video, and that person had to correct the mistake they made. After that, Kang-woo asked Nina to meet Yeon-sun to apologize, and she had to take pictures of the intimate images between the two of them. Kang-woo wanted to put an end to the rumors of discord between the sisters, as well as the rumors that Yeon-sun was a selfish and difficult person. At this time, Nina was standing secretly looking into Yeon-sun's house when she suddenly saw Dan appear. The two greeted each other and were almost discovered by Yeon-seon. After that, they went to eat together because Nina saw that Dan was hungry. Nina wants to know more about Yeon-sun. Dan wants to know more about Kang-woo. Nina praises Kang-woo and thinks he is a good person. Meanwhile, Yeon-sun gathers the servants in the house and asks them to do the work she assigned. However, they all want to quit. Yumi feels very difficult because now no one is willing to work for Yeon-sun because of her unpleasant personality. However, Yeon-sun does not care at all. Yeon-sun orders all the servants to leave the house immediately. Everyone is speechless and feels indignant. Yumi also does not believe that Yeon-sun can do such a thing. Yeon-sun angrily says that she does not need Yumi's care. Then Kang-woo goes to pick up his dog by himself. Then the doctor is happy when he learns that Yeon-sun is returning to ballet. Before Yeon-sun understands what is going on, the doctor shows her the news about today's press conference. It is announced that Yeon-sun will return to the stage. Soon after, Yeon-sun went to see Kang-woo to ask about this because she thought the press conference was arranged by him without her permission. She asked him to cancel the press conference because she would not be performing. At the same time, she asked the male dancer to find another partner to replace her. Yeon-sun was upset because Kang-woo made the decision without her consent. When Yeon-sun left, Kang-woo ran after her and begged her to come back to perform because he wanted her to shine again. However, Yeon-sun still did not agree. She threw him some money as payment for saving her when she had an accident. Kang-woo did not want to accept the money and continued to chase after her until Yeon-sun got into a taxi. Dan happened to see that scene and thought that the two were starting to date. Soon after, Dan saw the money on the ground and was overjoyed. Dan did not have any money, so he picked it all up without thinking. When Yeon-sun got home, she received an envelope from Young-ja. While Yeon-sun was looking at what was inside, Young-ja called. Young-ja arbitrarily extended her executive authority, saying that she wanted to help Yeon-sun quell rumors and prevent the board of directors from gossiping. Young-ja did not want Yeon-sun to perform or regain her position as CEO. Yeon-sun was angry and declared that she would show Young-ja how great she was. At the same time, Yeon-sun was determined to return and hold a press conference. This made Young-ja even more angry. After that, Yeon-sun tried to walk again by herself but fell and hurt herself. Suddenly, Yeon-sun thought of Dan and Yumi, but her pride did not allow Yeon-sun to beg them to come back and help her. Meanwhile, Dan went to the convenience store to eat noodles and met Hu as a sales clerk. Hu came to talk to Dan, surprising Dan. At the same time, Hu advised Dan to go back and help Yeon-sun. At this time, Yeon-sun had to cook rice by herself, but she could not do it, so Yeon-sun was upset with herself. At that moment, Yumi came and cooked for Yeon-sun. Yumi also hired the girl who made Yeon-sun trip. This girl said that she accidentally saw the technician come to talk to Young-ja. Yeon-sun and Yumi heard that and thought that he and Young-ja caused the incident that almost injured her because of the ceiling light. Right after that, Yeon-sun went to find Dan and found him lying on the bench where they first met. She wanted him to go back to work and help her practice walking. Dan had been waiting there, waiting for Yeon-sun to call him back. so he immediately agreed. But there was a condition. Meanwhile, Youngja was happy because she thought she was going to continue taking over the company. Youngja believed that Yun-sun would not dare to come to see her. Elsewhere, because he could not contact Yun-sun, Kang-woo became upset. He started to be strict with the dancers. He made them practice so hard that they had no time for their families. Nina waited for Kang-woo to get off work and invited him to dinner. She then told him about the situation with the dancers. Nina thought that what she had done to Yun-sun had made Kang-woo upset with the dancers. However, Nina believed that Yun-sun would come back because she knew Yun-sun's personality well. Hearing that, Kang-woo felt reassured and calmed down. Meanwhile, Dan was helping Yun-sun practice walking so that she could perform ballet again and attend the press conference again. Yun-sun practiced walking step by step, but she accidentally fell. At that moment, a little girl passed by and saw Dan and Yun-sun lying on the grass hugging each other. She thought they were about to kiss and teased them. Both Yun-sun and Dan were embarrassed. Right after that, Dan said that he wanted to fulfill the condition that the two had agreed upon before. Yun-sun immediately agreed. Then he took her to the temple to pray. Yun-sun was surprised and didn't understand why Dan brought her there. Suddenly, the two saw Kang-woo there, and he was about to pray. Dan immediately invited Kang-woo to join. It turned out that Dan had come to see Kang-woo. Dan offered to match Kang-woo and Yun-sun together because Dan saw that they were destined for each other. Then Yun-sun and Kang-woo prayed together. When she was confused about what to wish for, he told her to wish for one basic thing, which was happiness. When the three of them finished praying, Yun-sun discovered that she had lost her shoes. Dan immediately said that he would go look for them because he thought the thief hadn't gone far. However, Kang-woo was afraid that they would be late for the flower lantern release, so he wanted to quickly take Yun-sun there. Although Yun-sun wanted to wait for Dan to go together, she didn't want to delay Kang-woo either, so she agreed to let him carry her. There, Kang-woo thoughtfully prepared a towel for Yun-sun to stand up so that she wouldn't get her feet dirty. Then the two of them happily released the lanterns together. Meanwhile, Dan stood from afar and silently blessed them. The next day, Runa arbitrarily cut Yun-sun's appearance at press conference. Runa was happy because she thought Yun-sun wouldn't dare to come, but suddenly Yun-sun appeared and walked normally. This made Youngja extremely angry. Yun-sun was very happy that everyone attended the press conference. She announced her return as soon as possible. Youngja thought that Yun-sun had lied to her about not being able to walk, but Yun-sun asked Youngja to hand over the management to her because she was now healthy again. That made Youngja very angry. Youngja didn't want to hand over the company to Yun-sun, but Yun-sun insisted that the company originally belonged to her, leaving Youngja speechless. At this time, Yun-sun was wearing Dan's handkerchief on her wrist. When she saw the scarf, she felt like he was with her. Then the two met. Yun-sun tried to walk so that Dan could see how hard she tried. Dan saw that and was very proud of Yun-sun. Then they both drank to celebrate her return. Yun-sun thought that everything she did was thanks to Dan's help. Meanwhile, Dan thought that when Yun-sun was healthy and happy again, she would no longer need him by her side. Then Yun-sun wanted to fulfill Dan's wish. She told him to close his eyes, and she was about to kiss him on the cheek because she thought that was what he wanted. However, at the moment she was about to kiss him, he suddenly turned around and their lips accidentally touched. Yun-sun was extremely confused, but right after that, Dan took the initiative to kiss Yun-sun. That scene was seen by Kang-woo. Kang-woo was extremely sad. Kang-woo remembered the memory of when Yun-sun was injured and she fell into his arms. In the darkness, Kang-woo's image suddenly appeared with the shadow of a pair of wings. Maybe Kang-woo is also an angel like Dan. When he saw Yun-sun and Dan kissing, Kang-woo got angry and left. At that moment, Dan felt that it was about to rain. Dan was worried that his wings might be exposed, so he apologized to Yun-sun and hurriedly ran away. He ran as fast as he could to find shelter from the rain, but he couldn't find any. Luckily, Hu saved Dan in time and took him to safety. Meanwhile, Yun-sun was extremely angry because she thought Dan had left her in the rain after he had kissed her. At that moment, Kang-woo suddenly appeared and held an umbrella for Yun-sun and took her to the car. Kang-woo also carefully wiped Yun-sun's body to avoid catching a cold. At this moment, he suddenly remembered the happy memories when he and she used to be together. The current Kang-woo still cares about Yun-sun very much. He told her to pay attention to her health by eating and exercising regularly. He hopes that she can get back in shape within 2 weeks to prepare for her comeback. At the same time, he is worried that others will envy her when she returns. However, Yun-sun is adamant that she will get back in shape and skills within a week. Elsewhere, Runa sees Nina crying, so she worries and asks why. Nina recounts how Kang-woo rejected her confession. He also said that she is not as capable as Yun-sun. He says that her feelings are just temporary. He is not a good person that she can love. Those words hurt Nina and extinguish her newly kindled feelings. After hearing that, Runa feels that Nina is useless because she failed in both her career and love life. Runa leaves Nina crying alone. Meanwhile, Dan comes to see Hu while he is performing a ceremony ceremony in the church. Dan loudly asks Hu if he has ever kissed anyone. Hearing that, Hu feels ashamed and angry and wants to beat Dan up. Dan continued to ask about the guilt of an angel developing feelings for a human. Yun-sun told Dan to think of her like the dogs and cats he had helped to pass on. Dan then returned home. However, Dan did not want to enter the house because he was afraid of facing Yun-sun and his true feelings for her. Dan was worried that he would not be able to hide his feelings. Later, Dan was wandering on the street. At that time, Dan suddenly saw Kang-woo drinking alcohol, so he decided to go in. At that time, Kang-woo was upset because Dan was too intimate with Yeon-seon. On the contrary, Dan thought that Kang-woo was angry with him for no reason. As a result, the two argued. Dan then left, leaving Kang-woo angry at the bar. After Dan left, he promised himself that he would see Yun-sun as a plant. He would not let himself be moved by her anymore. But he wasn't sure if he could do it. At the same time, Kang-woo told himself that he wasn't jealous when he saw Yun-sun and Dan being intimate. However, deep down, Kang-woo knew he couldn't lie to himself. He was really jealous when he saw them together. The only thing Kang-woo wanted was for Yun-sun to be happy again, and to be happy when she could do what she loved. Not long after, Yumi went to see Yun-sun, and Yumi saw her sitting on a chair with a murderous look on her face. Yun-sun was angry because Dan had left without permission and hadn't come home all night. Yumi thought that they were just angry with each other, so she tried to comfort Yun-sun. Dan then returned home. When he saw Yun-sun being angry, Dan didn't dare say anything because he knew he was wrong. He was wrong to leave her alone and wrong to not come home all night. To ease the atmosphere, Dan and Yun-sun went for a walk together. At that time, he told her about Kiss yesterday. He hoped that she would pretend that nothing had happened, even though he knew that it would be difficult to forget. Although Yun-sun was unhappy, she eventually agreed to forget the kiss. However, she left in anger. Yun-sun thought that Dan was just playing with her feelings. Dan then returned to her room. While Dan was cleaning up, his heart skipped a beat when he accidentally saw a kissing scene in a comic book. Meanwhile, Yun-sun started practicing dancing again. While dancing, she suddenly remembered the accident on stage 3 years ago that left her blind. That memory caused Yun-sun to collapse and fall. At that moment, Dan, who had been standing outside watching Yun-sun for a long time, ran in and asked her kindly. Dan saw that Yun-sun's leg was bleeding, so he was extremely worried. He didn't want to see her get hurt because of dancing. However, Yun-sun immediately scolded Dan. She said she didn't want him to be with her while she danced. Then, she kicked him out. Nina then called Dan because she wanted to see Yun-sun, but Yun-sun quickly grabbed Dan's phone and said that she didn't want to see Nina. Yun-sun was surprised when she found out that Dan knew Nina. She immediately threatened him that if he contacted Nina again, the consequences would be terrible. Soon after, Dan and Yun-sun went outside and saw Nina standing in front of the gate waiting. Nina was happy when she saw Yun-sun. At the same time, Nina brought a gift to give to Yun-sun, but Yun-sun didn't want to accept it. Nina was still happy because she knew Yun-sun would return to the stage. Nina also wanted to challenge Yun-sun so that everyone would recognize her talent and so that no one would think she was just a shadow next to Yun-sun. While Dan felt that Nina was a good person, Yun-sun didn't think so. Not long after, Young-ja held a meeting to talk about Yun-sun's influence when she announced her comeback. Yun-sun's return helps the company gain a potential client. A board member suggests that Young-ja quickly return the chairmanship to Yun-sun because it was originally hers. However, Young-ja finds an excuse to delay the transfer of control. Young-ja decides to hold a performance to invite the potential client. When Kang-woo hears this news, he strongly objects. He is worried that the performance taking place too soon may affect Yun-sun's health. Later, during the dance practice session, Kang-woo suddenly feels uncomfortable when he sees the kiss scene between the two actors. That scene reminds Kang-woo of the kiss between Yun-sun and Dan. Because Kang-woo cannot control his emotions, he immediately asks Nina to help him guide everyone to practice. He will go outside to get some fresh air to calm down. Meanwhile, Yun-sun is asking Dan to help her practice ballet. She only asks him to stand still without saying anything and be a support for her to practice. At that time, his body and heart are beating erratically. His emotions surged every time she touched him. Dan felt like he was about to lose control of his mind, so he quickly ran outside. When Dan stepped out, he was surprised to see Yumi standing there. Yumi told Yun-sun that Kang-woo came to see her. Kang-woo said that he came because he wanted to see how Yun-sun was recovering in training. However, Yun-sun felt that it was unnecessary because she had Dan by her side to support her. Kang-woo was upset and asked to talk to Dan privately. During the conversation, Kang-woo wanted to know what Dan's purpose was in approaching Yun-sun. Kang-woo suspected that Dan was approaching her only for money, but Dan calmly replied that money was fleeting and he didn't need it. Kang-woo immediately assumed that if it wasn't for money, Dan must have approached Yun-sun because he liked her. However, Dan denied it. Dan then went to Hu to confess that he had kissed Yun-so and that his heart fluttered every time he saw her. Hu told Dan a story. Once upon a time, there was an angel who was passionate about art. Because he fell in love with a human, he committed a huge sin. That mistake caused the person he loved to suffer the consequences. Those people were none other than Kang Woo and Yun-son. But Hu did not mention their names in the story. When Dan returned home, Yumi said that Yun-son refused to eat anything. She was extremely worried. Yumi asked Dan to find a way to help Yun-son eat. He quickly ran into the place where she was practicing. However, she scolded him for entering while she was practicing. He was just worried that she would get hurt when she kept dancing in a tense state. Yun-son began to suspect and asked Dan if he liked her, so he did all that. Dan thought for a long time and finally denied it. Those words made Yun-son feel disappointed. However, Dan still saw Yun-son practicing day and night to the point that her legs were bleeding and her body was weak. He was very worried about her. At the same time, Youngja called Yun-son to meet her. Youngja wanted Yun-son to perform in front of an important client, but Yun-son did not agree and left. Yun-son only asked Youngja to hand over the management to her. Meanwhile, Dan accidentally found a photo of the moment where Yun-son first performed. Kangwoo wanted to take Yun-son to a special place for her to relax. At this time, Dan was already there and was preparing the stage for Yun-son. Just as Dan was about to leave, he suddenly saw Kangwoo and Yun-son appear, so he quickly hid somewhere nearby. With Dan's help, Kangwoo took Yun-son to the place where she started ballet. This made Yun-son extremely happy, but Yun-son thought that it was Dan who told Kangwoo about this place and that Dan had prepared everything. So Yun-son immediately called Dan's name, but there was no response. Kangwoo heard that and said that he just wanted Yun-son to regain her confidence before her performance. He advised her to relax her mind and not worry about anything and to dance here to make her feel happier. Hearing that, Yun-son started to dance ballet. Meanwhile, Dan was still quietly watching Yun-son. He found her dancing so beautifully that it made his heart flutter. He felt like he was almost done with his mission, but at the same time, he felt a sharp pain for some reason. Suddenly, a memory appeared. A little girl was dancing in front of a little boy. That little boy was extremely happy and touched when he saw her perform. Yun-son now thought that Kang-woo was the little boy from back then and was the first person to see her perform. But Kang-woo was completely oblivious when he heard that memory mentioned. On the contrary, Kang-woo only remembered the memories with Yun-son in the past when she was very happy and cheerful beside him. She used to dance passionately for him to watch. In a moment of emotion, Kang-woo knelt down on one knee and confessed to Yun-son. He hoped she would allow him to love her. In the midst of that romantic scene, Dan suddenly slipped and fell out of his hiding place. Kang-woo's confession was immediately broken, making him extremely upset. Yun-son was surprised when she saw Dan appear. Yun-son suddenly realized that all of the things that had just happened were arranged by Dan. In Yun-son's mind, Dan hid there just to watch her dance and thought she was ridiculous. But Dan quickly said that Yun-son's dance was beautiful. It made his heart both happy and painful. However, Yun-son thought that Dan was just lying. After that, Kang-woo took both Yun-son and Dan home. On the way back, Kang-woo reminded Yun-son to prepare everything well for this comeback. Dan thought that Kang-woo's actions were depraved because he thought that Kang-woo had put Yun-son in a dangerous situation. Therefore, the two men argued fiercely. That night, Dan dreamed of a boy falling off cliff into the ocean. He woke up covered in sweat. Then Dan heard Yun-son calling him to her. Yun-son wanted to know how Dan knew where she first performed when she herself couldn't remember. Dan gave Yun-son a photo of her dancing at the beach when she was little. He complimented her on how bright her smile was. Dan also said that he just wanted to do something to make Yun-son happy as a maid. Dan finally apologized if what he did made Yun-son uncomfortable. Then he quietly left. Yun-son then put the photo of her at the beach on the wall and started practicing dancing again. After that, Yun-son seemed to have found her passion again. At the same time, Dan decided to register for driving lessons because he wanted to be able to drive Yun-son in the future. During class, he practiced driving with the instructor. However, when Dan was about to test drive, he suddenly saw the teacher transformed into the Hu. Dan was shocked. At that moment, Hu said that he wanted to help Dan, but Dan felt that Hu was strange. Hu continued to guide Dan to drive. However, because this was Dan's first time driving, he drove incorrectly, making Hu dizzy. In the end, Dan got angry and did not want to learn anything more from Hu. After that, Dan wanted to ask Hu to help him learn more about Kang-woo. Meanwhile, Kang-woo visited the resting place of his ex-lover named Choi Sun-hee. She looked exactly like Yeon-son. On Sun-hee's grave there was a handkerchief like Dan's. There was also a ring. When Kang-woo saw them, he remembered the time when he and Sun-hee ran away, but they were blocked by two other angels. In fact, Kang-woo was an angel who inspired artists. He was punished because he wanted to give up being an angel to love a human. At that time, they took back everything that the gods had given him, but Sun-hee didn't want Kang-woo to be sad and punished, so she stood stood up to protect him. However, because she was only human, she couldn't resist the god's magic. In the end, Sun Hee was seriously injured, bleeding profusely, and died. Kangwoo was in despair and painfully hugged the person he loved. He tried to find a way to leave heaven many times but failed. Another time, Hu transformed into a monk and advised Kangwoo to accept his fate as the gods had decided. But Kangwoo refused. Meanwhile, Yun-sun was preparing to attend an event. Yumi was worried and didn't want Yun-sun to go because she was afraid that someone would harm Yun-sun. However, Yun-sun still insisted on attending. Yun-sun remembered that she was rejected by Dan, so she felt insecure and dependent on him, so she secretly went to the pharmacy to buy sedatives to calm herself down. At the same time, Dan was practicing driving, but he still couldn't do it. Kangwoo saw it, so he wanted to help Dan. But this intervention only made Dan more annoyed. While the two were still arguing, Yun-sun appeared with a beautiful and gorgeous appearance that attracted both Dan and Kangwoo. Immediately after that, Kangwoo offered to drive Yun-sun to the event because he was worried that Dan's driving would be dangerous. Dan had to agree because he knew he wasn't good at driving. Yet, Kangwoo then drove Yun-sun and Dan to meet the client. The party was held on a yacht. After they arrived, Yun-sun and Kangwoo went to greet the guests. Immediately after that, Youngja acted friendly with Yun-sun but was pushed away by Yun-sun. Youngja was extremely upset. Youngja immediately mocked Yun-sun, making her extremely angry. At this time, because Kangwoo needed to do some work, he had to ask Dan to pick up Yun-sun. Although Yun-sun didn't want to, she still let Dan help her because she felt that there were too many strangers around. Meanwhile, Dan remembered Yumi's instructions to carefully observe the surroundings to see if there was anything that could endanger Yun-sun, especially the ceiling lights. At this time, the important guests at the party showed that they really liked and admired Yun-sun's talent. He even tried to touch her, but Dan intervened in time. At this time, Kangwoo instructed the dancers to perform their best and reminded them not to exaggerate or be self-conscious about their abilities. Then the party began with a ballet performance. The other guests still wanted to hold Yun-sun's hand, but a member of the committee stopped him. He thought that Yun-sun was too difficult, so he suggested finding someone else. When the guest looked up the stage, he showed interest in Nina's legs. The other person immediately said, "I will bring Nina to you." Yun-sun felt disgusted when she saw that. Not long after, the guest asked to see Yun-sun dance. However, she flatly refused. Youngja stood watching from afar and thought that Yun-sun was really good at enduring those perverts. Youngja immediately signaled for someone to start carrying out the plan to harm Yun-sun. Meanwhile, Dan discovered someone acting suspiciously, so he chased after him. That person said he was just going to smoke because he was craving. Hearing that, Dan apologized and left. But right after that, Dan saw another suspicious person bringing wine to Yun-sun. Dan immediately attacked that person, surprising everyone at the party. Seeing that, Kangwoo quickly reminded Dan to leave before others gossip. Meanwhile, a doctor was putting poison in Yun-sun's glass of wine. But when he turned around, he saw Ki-chon. He panicked and spilled the glass of wine. Ki-chon knew that his wife had ordered the doctor to poison Yun-sun, so Ki-chon asked the doctor not to harm Yun-sun no matter who was behind him. At the same time, Youngja waited for a long time, but the doctor did not bring out the wine, so she looked confused. At that moment, Runa told Youngja that he would not harm Yun-sun. Hearing that, Youngja was very surprised. Then Runa immediately had someone bring grapes for Yun-sun to eat. Finally, Youngja stood up to speak and announced that she would resign. At the same time, Youngja would hand over the management to Yun-sun. When Yun-sun was about to step up to receive the award, she suddenly felt dizzy, lightheaded. At that moment, Dan bumped into the person who plotted to harm Yun-sun. Dan immediately chased after him, but in the end, he still escaped. Meanwhile, Yun-sun inside began to be affected by the poison that Runa had put in. Yun-sun gradually lost control and had strange behaviors. Immediately after that, Yun-sun rushed to hit the guest and cursed him as a disgusting, perverted person, an action that shocked everyone at the party. Not stopping there, she kept swearing. Because Yun-sun was on stimulants, she started dancing unconsciously and almost fell into the water, but luckily, Dan caught Yun-sun in time. After the incident, Yun-sun dreamed of her and the boy from the past watching her dance ballet. The two of them played around innocently. When Yun-sun woke up, she was extremely confused because she remembered what happened yesterday on the boat. Yun-sun called Kangwoo, but he didn't pick up. At that time, Kangwoo was attending a board meeting. The board members didn't want someone as rude and mentally ill as Yun-sun to take over the company. They also asked to remove Yun-sun from the upcoming performance. However, Kangwoo firmly defended Yun-sun to the end despite their constant provocations. Immediately after, Nina came to inform Kangwoo that the dancers would go on strike if Yun-sun continued to perform with them because they did not accept someone like Yun-sun. Kangwoo was very angry when he heard that. He loudly scolded them for being unprofessional and lacking in skills. Kangwoo also bluntly criticized Nina for dancing empty and soulless. This made Nina ecstatic and turned to alcohol to drown her sorrows. While Nina was drunk, she accidentally met her dance teacher. However, as soon as he saw her, the teacher ran away and did not want to have anything to do with Fantasia. Meanwhile, Dan went to see Runa in the hope that she would investigate Yeon-seon's case with him, but Runa refused and she thought it was Yeon-seon's fault. Yeon-seon could not control herself. Even though Dan tried to explain that Yeon-seon might have been harmed by someone, Runa still did not believe it. This made Dan extremely disappointed because Runa was Yeon-seon's relative. She did not stand by Yeon-seon. Then on the way back, Dan accidentally saw the suspicious person who appeared on the boat the day before. Dan chased after him, but when Dan ran near Runa's room, he lost track of him. Dan was even threatened by Runa. She said she would call the police if he dared to break into her office again. Meanwhile, Yeon-seon and Yumi decided to call the doctor to take blood for testing. They hoped to find evidence to prove Yeon-seon's innocence. At the same time, Dan also told Yeon-seon that he had gone to Fantasia to investigate. However, Dan discovered that people there were gossiping a lot about Yeon-seon. They did not trust Yeon-seon to take over the company. They also thought that she should not return to ballet. Yeon-seon was very sad when she heard those gossips. Suddenly, Young-ja appeared and looked for Yeon-seon. As soon as she saw Young-ja, Yeon-seon was not happy. Young-ja announced that the transfer of management to Yeon-seon had been cancelled because the board of directors did not trust her mental health. Young-ja also said that Yeon-seon should give up ballet because no one would welcome her back. Yeon-seon suspected that someone was trying to harm her, but Young-ja immediately denied it strongly. Dan was angry on Yeon-seon's behalf when he heard this conversation. Dan loudly scolded Young-ja for being heartless to her own family. It was Young-ja who forced Yeon-seon to the brink and did not give her a way to live. Dan also said that Young-ja was greedy for material things, so she would definitely be punished appropriately. Yeon-seon was surprised when she heard Dan say such strong words. Young-ja also got angry and sarcastically said that the two of them were really similar. They were both crazy. After that, Yeon-seon kicked Young-ja out of the house. Dan saw that Yeon-seon was sad, so he comforted her. He advised her to stop drinking. Dan believed that Yeon-seon would be cleared when the blood test results came out. However, when Yeon-seon received the results, it was discovered that there were sedative ingredients that she had bought at the pharmacy. So she thought that this result would not be recognized as evidence to clear her name. In her drunkenness, Yeon-seon told Dan about the boy who saw her perform when she was little. It was that boy who gave her inspiration and motivation so that she could be confident in herself and her talent. But at this moment, Yeon-seon wanted to give up everything to live a normal life like everyone else. In a moment of emotion, Yeon-seon suddenly danced for Dan to see. Unfortunately, she accidentally tripped, but he caught her in time. Dan then carried Yeon-seon home. On the way back, Yeon-seon wanted to know why Dan didn't like her when he had kindly helped and saved her many times. When Dan took Yeon-seon back to his room, he confessed his feelings. He said that he couldn't like her or be with her forever because he was an angel. But when he thought about being away from her, his heart ached. Finally, Dan confessed that he really liked Yeon-seon. Dan then wandered around and remembered Who's warning that angels are not allowed to love humans. That made Dan even more miserable. Suddenly, Kang-woo appeared and attacked Dan because he thought that Dan had advised Yeon-seon to give up ballet. Dan asked Kang-woo to let go, but Kang-woo refused. Then the two struggled fiercely. Finally, the two lost their balance and fell into the water. While they were slowly sinking, Dan suddenly remembered the image of the boy trying to fight to not fall into the sea. Luckily, Dan was pulled up by the rescue team in time. Dan coughed and told the rescuers that another person had also fallen into the water and asked them to find him. However, Dan saw Kang-woo from afar, safe and sound. That surprised him greatly. The doctor asked Dan to lie down for a health check, but he did not want to. In Dan's mind, a dream of the boy falling into the water suddenly appeared. Dan didn't know if it was just a dream or a memory from the past. Dan thought that the boy was Kang-woo. Maybe Kang-woo heard the conversation between Dan and Yeon-seon, so he acted like that. Suddenly, Kang-woo appeared behind the curtain, making Dan extremely surprised. At this time, Kang-woo thought that Dan was wrong when he told Yeon-seon to give up ballet. Then Kang-woo told Dan that Yeon-seon tried to find death when she was blind. At the same time, Kang-woo emphasized that Dan telling Yeon-seon to give up dancing was no different than telling her to die. Kang-woo warned Dan not to make Yeon-seon fall further into the abyss or he would beat Dan up. Dan immediately ran after Kang-woo and admitted that he had feelings for Yeon-seon, so he just wanted her to be happy. At first, Dan thought that Kang-woo would bring happiness to Yeon-seon, but Dan only saw that Kang-woo made Yeon-seon more stressed. Then the doctor wanted Dan to get tested, but he didn't want to, and left. It turns out that the doctor is actually Who transformed. Who worries about Dan when he realizes that Dan is starting to have feelings for a human. Meanwhile, Young-ja wants to ask Runa about the company when Nina suddenly appears. Young-ja notices that Nina smells of alcohol, so Young-ja scolds Nina. Young-ja has never seen Nina drink alcohol before. Nina then asks Young-ja about the teacher teacher who taught her in the past. But Youngja and Runa's attitudes are extremely harsh when they hear about that person. Youngja gets angry when she remembers that the teacher once drowned Nina in the bathtub. The purpose was just to make her imagine the ocean scene. So Youngja yells at Nina to never mention that person's name again. At the same time, Yumi brings the blood test results to Yunson. Yumi advises Yunson to use these results to deal with Youngja if she is pushed to the edge. Yumi also expresses her dissatisfaction when she finds Youngja too much. Youngja dares to ask Yunson to resign. Not long after, Youngja calls Yunson to threaten her to quickly leave the company and hand over all management rights to Youngja. On the way to take Yunson to meet Youngja, Dan suddenly changes direction to the bridge where he fell yesterday. He stands on the edge of the bridge and is about to jump off, making her extremely scared. At this time, Dan shares that he knows how Yunson feels when she is down there, because he himself has experienced it. He reminds her that he used to advise her to give up ballet to live comfortably, but now he has changed his mind. He wants her to continue her passion, and he promises to always be by her side, no matter what she decides to do or where she goes. Meanwhile, Kang-woo receives news that all activities of the dance troupe will be suspended due to lack of funds. He quickly understands that someone is involved in this. When Kang-woo calls the person behind it, the person admits that he did it because he was hit by Kang-woo's car and threatened yesterday. The next day, Yunson attended the board meeting. Here, Youngja continued to ask Yunson to give up the right to run the company because of the recent scandals she caused, but Yunson bowed her head and apologized to everyone for causing trouble. Youngja immediately announced that Yunson would resign. However, Yunson strongly replied that they should give her a chance to prove her ability. At this time, some people still did not believe Yunson. Some even asked Yunson to kneel down and sincerely apologize. Yunson approached and said that he was a braggart because he knew nothing about ballet but pretended to know. Yunson frankly challenged that if the upcoming performance failed, she would resign to please them. At the same time, Yunson announced that after the performance, everyone would choose together who would leave the company. When Dan witnessed that, he felt proud of Yunson. Kang-woo hugs Yunson and promises to create a great show with her. Youngja feels that Yunson is a cunning fox because she always prevents Youngja from taking control of the company. Youngja thinks that she is the one who deserves to own Fantasia. Yunson wants to know when Youngja started to crave this company. Since Youngja's parents passed away, or since Youngja found out that Youngja was blind. Yunson asserts that she will show Youngja that she is more worthy of being the company's boss than Youngja. Soon after, Kang-woo asks Dan when he will quit his job at Yunson's house. Kang-woo also says that Dan should give up trying to convince Yunson to stop her passion for ballet. However, Dan believes that Yunson solved everything for herself and Kang-woo did not help her at all. Not long after, Yunson hears that the dancers are on strike and wants to go and convince them to come back to work herself. However, Kang-woo stops her and says that he will solve it himself because he caused it. The dancers then call Kang-woo and give him 3 wishes. The first is that Kang-woo will not let Yunson be the female lead. The second is that they do not want Kang-woo to continue to manage them in an autocratic manner. The third is that they want to be respected more. Hearing this, Kang-woo threatens them. Kang-woo shouted that everyone had to be there on time tomorrow or he would fire them and immediately find other dancers to replace them because Kang-woo knew that there were many people who wanted to work at Fantasia. After Kang-woo finished speaking, he hung up. The dancers were extremely confused. They were afraid of being fired, so they started to change their minds. Meanwhile, Yunson could not accept Kang-woo using threats to force the dancers. Yunson did not want them to return to work reluctantly. Dan also sarcastically said that Kang-woo's way of doing things was wrong. Dan then thought about whether he should call Nina to ask her to help Yunson. In the end, Yunson took the initiative to call Nina to beg. Yunson convinced Nina to reveal where the dancers were by saying that she wanted to compete fairly with Nina. Hearing that, Nina agreed to help Yunson. At this time, the dancers in the troupe were still worried about being fired. They thought that just doing charity work here would not solve anything. Yunson suddenly appeared and expressed her desire to help the needy with them. However, many people thought that Yunson was just pretending to care, so they wanted to chase her away. Fortunately, Nina stood up and helped Yunson stay. Soon after, Yunson took care of the lonely elderly people and danced and sang together to bring joy. When Yunson returned home, Yumi gave her a cake. Yumi wanted Yunson to blow out the candles to celebrate. However, Yunson did not, accepted happily, and just went back to her room to rest. Dan told Yumi that the dancers' strike made Yunson unhappy. Runa was also unhappy when Kang-woo arbitrarily fired the dancers and hired new ones. The next day, Yunson went to the place where the dancers were doing charity work, which surprised everyone. At this time, there was an old woman in the nursing home who had lost her memory, so she caused chaos and started a fire. Everyone ran away in panic panic, but Dan quickly put out the fire. Then the dancers wanted to know who started fire. Yunson took the blame for the old woman. Hearing this, they were angry and did not want to see Yunson there anymore. The dancers were afraid that Yunson would hurt them. They thought that she only came to them when she needed help. This made Yunson very sad. Then Dan asked why Yunson did not tell the truth that she did not start the fire. Yunson confessed that she was afraid that if she told, the old woman would be taken away. But Dan thought that Yunson could convince the dancers because they shared a passion for ballet. Dan believed that they were angry with Yunson because they did not understand her. If they performed together, maybe they would change their minds and accept Yunson. At first, Nina and the dancers thought that Yunson would not come back today. But surprisingly, they saw Yunson and Dan sitting and talking with the grandparents related to yesterday's fire. The old lady apologized because she was the one who caused the incident, but Yunson took the blame instead. After hearing that, the dancers realized that they had wrongly blamed Yunson. They felt embarrassed. Right after that, Yunson suggested that Kangwoo hold an audition for the female lead in the upcoming performance. Yunson wanted her and all the dancers in the troupe to have a fair chance to compete. They were all surprised to hear that. However, Kangwoo did not agree because he had his own way. Kangwoo said he would help Yunson, but she did not want that. She hoped that he would believe in her ability. In another development, Nina went to find the teacher who taught her ballet. When she saw Nina, the teacher ran away. Nina immediately chased after her and begged the teacher to teach her ballet because she wanted to become a professional dancer. Meanwhile, Dan went to the supermarket to buy groceries and cook for Yunson, who transformed into a shopper and teased Dan that he was in love, and that's why he became like that. At that moment, Kangwoo happened to see this scene and he started to suspect. Then he went to find information about them. Finally, Kangwoo went to the church and met Hu in the identity of a priest. Kangwoo asked Hu a few questions to see if Dan was an angel. Then he left right after that. At this time, Dan was cooking rice for Yunson, but he was still quite clumsy. When she saw that, she wanted to help him. However, because she had never cut tomatoes before, she was confused. He immediately held her hand and gave her detailed instructions. While cooking, he accidentally spilled a pot of boiling water on the floor. She worriedly asked him if he was okay, but he was afraid that she might get burned, so he picked her up, making her shy. After that, the two of them ate noodles together and exchanged loving glances. Yunson recalled the moment she cooked with Dan and suddenly felt happy and excited. At night, Dan dreamed again of the boy he had seen in his previous dreams. But this time, a little girl named Yunson appeared in the dream. That dream startled Dan awake. Dan immediately ran to the church to ask Hu about the meaning of the dream. Hu thought that Dan was no longer normal because he wanted to become human so much that he had that dream. Dan wondered what would happen if he really became human. Then Hu took Dan to the nursing home. There, Dan was surprised to see two people he had saved in the fire. Dan couldn't believe his eyes when he saw that the old man was an angel. It turned out that he had intentionally kept the old woman from passing away so that she could stay with him longer. However, Hu had to obey the god's orders. Hu had to punish the angel for daring to interfere with human life. The old man begged Hu to stop. He wanted to say goodbye to her one last time. Immediately after that, Hu used magic to turn the angel into dust. The old woman witnessed that scene and cried in pain. Hu warned that this was the price for Dan to become human. The person he loved would suffer for the rest of his life. Dan was extremely scared when he thought about how much pain Yunson would suffer if he disappeared one day. Because she was so sad about losing her husband, the old woman fainted. Dan then took her to the emergency room. Dan then returned home and suddenly told Yunson that he wanted to quit working at her house. Yunson was very surprised. That night, Yunson had a beautiful dream. In the dream, Yunson and Dan lived happily together until old age. They took pictures together and smiled happily. When Yunson woke up, she prepared breakfast for Dan. When Dan returned, Yunson was very happy and boasted that the food she cooked was more delicious than yesterday. However, Dan did not care and said that he wanted to quit his job. Those words shocked Yunson. She wanted to know the reason. She thought he lied when he promised to always be by her side. So Yunson was angry. Dan could only say sorry. Yunson remembered that she once heard Dan whisper that he liked her while she was sleeping. Moreover, Yunson also knew that Dan always cared for and protected her. At that time, Dan admitted that he really had feelings for Yunson. However, Dan said that the two of them could not be together forever because Yunson could walk now and she did not need him anymore. Dan said that the promise he once made to Yunson was just a slip of the tongue when he was drunk, so Dan hoped that Yunson would forget it. Soon after, Yumi appeared and saw them arguing. Yunson immediately asked Yumi to pay Dan all the money because she did not want to owe him anything. This surprised Yumi very much. She did not understand what was going on. Then Yumi tried to hold Dan back by saying that he needed to hand over the work to someone else. However, Dan flatly refused. Dan wanted to say goodbye to Yunson, but Yumi noticed that Yunson Yeon was unhappy, so she urged Dan to leave quickly. Meanwhile, Kang-woo was afraid that Dan would take Yeon away from him, so he called Dan. However, Yumi was the one who picked up the phone. Kang-woo was very surprised. Yumi said that Dan had suddenly quit his job after he had an argument with Yeon. Dan left without handing over the work. Dan then went to the church one last time and left. Who was worried that Dan might be hurt because of love. At that moment, Who saw Kang-woo also coming to the church to see Dan, so Who immediately stopped Kang-woo. Kang-woo frantically searched every corner of the church, but he still couldn't find Dan. In a fit of anger, Kang-woo tried to sneak attack Who with the candle, but Who used magic to turn it into a flower. Kang-woo was shocked to realize that Dan and Who were angels. Kang-woo then got angry and left. Meanwhile, Kang-woo was happy to see Yeon return to ballet. Kang-woo says that the two of them will be together. Yeon then went into the female dancer's dressing room, surprising everyone. Yeon just wanted to find an empty locker, but no one showed her or gave her any. Finally, Yeon discovered an empty locker, but there were a lot of other people's things left inside. However, Yeon was not angry. She still thanked everyone for coming to the practice session. At the same time, she hoped that she and they would get along. Then Yeon changed clothes. She went out to warm up and ignored the disdainful looks of her colleagues. Suddenly, Runa and Youngja also appeared in the practice room. Youngja said that she would stand by the dancers, so she would not pursue their strike. Youngja also asked Kang-woo not to join the judging panel because Youngja thought that he would be biased towards Yeon. On the contrary, Kang-woo also did not want Youngja to join the judging panel because he thought she would be biased towards Nina. Kang-woo suggested that the dancers evaluate and vote for each other to ensure fairness. However, Youngja objected because she thought it was unreasonable. Kang-woo argued that if Youngja was on the dancers' side, she should support them and show them fairness. In the end, although Youngja was unhappy, she reluctantly agreed. Kang-woo was angry that Youngja came without notice. On the other hand, Youngja was also upset because he and Kang-woo had set up the audition without consulting her. Meanwhile, Runa blamed Kang-woo for making a mess of the meeting on the yacht. Kang-woo replied that they should wait for this performance because he was sure Yeon would win. Youngja immediately scolded Runa for provoking Kang-woo. However, Runa was still determined not to see Kang-woo being arrogant, so she continued to attack him because she thought he was unprofessional. After that, Yeon practiced with the dancers. Kang-woo told them the story of the female lead, a woman who suffered because she loved a man who had deceived her. At this moment, Yeon suddenly remembered the memories she had with Dan. Meanwhile, the doctor was on his way to meet Yumi to give her evidence against Youngja, but suddenly a strange man snatched his file bag, making him panic. The doctor told Yumi about the important file being snatched. He also said that someone was following him and wanted to assassinate him. The person who snatched the bag was Runa's subordinate. Then he brought the file back to her. Runa immediately ordered him to kill the doctor to avoid the evil being exposed. Meanwhile, Dan went to the nursing home to visit the old lady. The doctor told him that they could not find the old man's body. When Dan heard that, he just said that maybe the old man had gone to a faraway place. Through the doctor, Dan learned that a year ago, the old man had died, but he suddenly returned to the old lady. At that moment, Dan wanted to ask the old lady about the old man, but she had not yet woken up, so he decided to find out the truth himself. Who advised Dan to stay at the nursing home, but he refused. Dan did not want to see Who around him because he thought Who had done something very evil. Who warned Dan to stay away from Yeon and Kang-woo. However, Dan replied that he would not run away like a coward. Dan would go find the truth. At the same time, Youngja sneaked into Runa's room to look for something, but was suddenly discovered by Runa. Youngja immediately lied that she was just looking for medicine. Youngja then invited Runa to drink with her. Youngja confided that she was very grateful that Runa had matured since Runa was little. Runa always took care of Nina whenever Youngja was busy. Youngja then suddenly asked Runa if she was trying to kill Yeon. It turned out that Kichon had scolded Youngja earlier for using dirty tricks just for fame and fortune. But Youngja only admitted that she had put the medicine away, but it was spilled. Hearing that, Kichon asked who did Sungwon's death due to the car's brake being cut off. Hearing this, Youngja was very surprised because she did not do that. This made her very sad. Youngja just hoped that Runa could live happily and not be tainted by the same crime as her. Meanwhile, Yeon was practicing hard, but she still could not avoid the contemptuous and sarcastic looks of the other dancers. Meanwhile, Yumi was waiting for Yeon to come back from ballet practice. At the same time, Yumi was looking for a candidate to replace Dan, but she had not found one. Yet, when she saw Yeon, Yumi asked if the practice was fun. Yeon shyly lied that she was very happy and loved by everyone. Immediately after that, Yeon suddenly remembered Dan. She blamed herself for thinking about him all the time. Then Yeon left Yumi and took a taxi to the church to find Dan, who was very surprised when he saw Yeon there. Yeon asked about Dan, but she could not get any more information. Yeon was very sad sad. When Yunsun walked out of the church, Kangwoo saw her. Then he took her out drinking to forget Dan. Kangwoo said that Dan was not as good a person as she thought. However, Yunsun got angry when she heard that. Yunsun thought that Kangwoo was deliberately trying to badmouth Dan. Yunsun promised that she would focus on training, so Yunsun asked Kangwoo not to interfere in her feelings. Then Yunsun left, making Kangwoo upset. Then Yunsun went to the bench where she and Dan first met, hoping that she would see him there. She burst into tears and called his name. From afar, Dan stood watching, unable to hold back her emotions. Finally, he walked over and talked to her. He hoped that she would give up on him. She was extremely happy when she saw him, but he told her not to like him anymore because his feelings for her were only temporary. He advised her to find someone better and then turned away. However, she held on to him. She insisted that she would be the one to give up on him first. Then Yunsun left. Yunsun cried and told herself that she would pretend Dan never existed. Dan was also very sad when he was forced to say words that hurt Yunsun. He returned to the nursing home to take care of the old woman. That night, Dan dreamed of the boy and girl who had appeared in his dream before. They drew a heart on the wall together. When Dan woke up with a start, he couldn't find the old woman anywhere. He quickly ran to look for her and found her in the reed field. She confided that when the old man left, she was very sad, but at the same time, she was also happy because he loved her deeply. She said that she had known early on that the old man was an angel. She had no regrets. Then she closed her eyes and let go. In the end, the old woman passed away in Dan's arms. That moment made Dan understand what love was. He was also in pain. Dan decided to find the place where the story between him and Yunsun began. At this time, Yunsun was rehearsing with the dancers in front of Kangwoo. Before that, Nina was advised by her teacher to wear a blindfold when dancing to express the character's emotions. Nina listened, but only received harsh criticism from Kangwoo. When it was Yunsun's turn, she started dancing, but Kangwoo immediately told Yunsun to stop because he thought she couldn't show the new side of the character. Yunsun replied that she didn't want to act in a forced new way, but wanted to show the true soul of the character. That made Kangwoo angry. Yunsun continued to dance and put all her emotions into showing Kangwoo the true feelings of the character. Yunsun acted so passionately that everyone was amazed and applauded in unison. Meanwhile, Dan went to the place he often saw in his dreams. The locals showed him the boy's house. When Dan entered, childhood memories suddenly flooded back. Dan remembered that he used to live in this very place. Dan found the gift that Yunsun gave him when he was little. Back to the past, since he was little, Dan was often beaten, so his childhood was extremely dark. But thanks to Yunsun's appearance, Dan's life has light and hope. Back in the present, Dan realizes that his feelings for Yunsun are very deep, so Dan decides to run to find Yunsun immediately. Meanwhile, Kangwoo is extremely angry because Yunsun has portrayed the character's inner self differently from what he wanted. But Yunsun just gently says that there are people who, no matter how hard you try to hate, you can't hate. Kangwoo is silent because he himself has lost a loved one, so he understands the pain that Yunsun wants to convey. However, Kangwoo still advises Yunsun to stay awake. He says he doesn't want to be disappointed by her anymore. After saying that, he leaves. Yunsun remembers Dan. She wants to call him but can't. Happy memories with him come flooding back. She wanders to the places they've been. That night, she dreams of a boy. When she wakes up, she wonders why she had that dream. Yumi was surprised to see Yunsun still awake in the middle of the night, vacuuming the practice room. Yunsun told Yumi about her dream. Yumi suspected that the boy might be her childhood memory. Yumi advised Yumi to focus on herself and keep her mind calm because the performance day was approaching. Yumi also told Yunsun to find a place where she felt happy to relax her mind if possible. Then Yunsun called Kangwoo to ask for leave. Kangwoo wanted Yumi to calm down quickly and return to practice, but Yunsun only said that she hoped Kangwoo would have a different view of her dance. Then Yunsun promised to contact him later. At the same time, the teacher who taught Nina suddenly blocked Kangwoo's way. She said that he almost got the person he loved, but in the end he let her go. She blamed him for not knowing what to do next. Kangwoo was angry because she touched his weak point. Kangwoo then asked her who she was and why she was there. She just said that she wanted to find out what Yunsun was worried about and then left. Meanwhile, Yunsun went to the place where she used to live as a child. Kangwoo happened to see Dan there too. Yunsun was very surprised. Dan wanted to tell Yunsun the whole truth, but Yunsun ignored her and didn't want Dan to follow her. She went to ask the villagers about the boy's house in her dream. The villagers told her to give more details so they could help her find it. Yunsun remembered and said that on a rainy day, she met the boy who was thinking of ending things. But Yunsun stopped him in time and the two became friends. After that, they often went out together until one day she had to move away. At that time, she was extremely sad to be away from him and just wanted to say goodbye. She used to dance for the boy and he praised it as the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. Yunsun now really wants to see the boy from back then, but the villagers say he's dead. This makes her extremely extremely heartbroken. They say that the boy died because he was so afraid of his father beating him that he jumped into the sea. Then the father also moved away from the island. Meanwhile, Dan stands by the cliff and recalls the last memory before the boy died. Dan is in pain and devastated when those images return. At the same time, Youngja sends a doctor to investigate the financial situation of the dancers so that she can bribe their votes. She offers him money, but he firmly refuses. At the same time, the doctor tells her not to threaten him anymore. He then runs away in fear, making Youngja extremely upset. Meanwhile, Kangwoo goes to the island where Yun-son is. Yun-son goes to the flower field where she and the boy used to play. Yun-son bursts into tears thinking about it because he is no longer in this world. Dan sees that scene and immediately goes to comfort Yun-son. Yun-son burst into tears and said that she felt guilty for not caring about the boy's feelings in the past. Yun-son used to laugh carefreely at the boy's pain. She regretted not being able to help him when he was panicking in his last moments. Dan advised Yun-son not to blame herself because he believed that the boy did not resent her. Dan believed that he would always remember Yun-son with the purest feelings. Then, Kangwoo went to the stage to find Yun-son, but he did not see her. At the same time, Dan apologized to Yun-son for his harsh words the day before. Yun-son was sad because Dan still decided not to return to her. She confided that she was very sad when her parents and uncle abandoned her, so Yun-son hoped that Dan could stay by her side. However, Dan still kept his distance. He only asked her to fulfill the last condition as promised, which was not to complain about what he asked. He asked her to give him more time to settle his personal matters and he promised to come back to her. Before leaving, Dan gave Yun-son a handkerchief. He told her to take care of herself without him. That coldness made Yun-son extremely miserable. Kangwoo witnessed everything from afar. Kangwoo walked over to hug Yun-son and advised her to forget Dan, because Dan did not deserve her. But Yun-son angrily pushed Kangwoo away. Yun-son said that she was very grateful that Kangwoo had given her the opportunity to return to the stage, but she asked him not to interfere in her private feelings. Kangwoo only replied that he would interfere this one more time. After that, Kangwoo took Yun-son home. He intended to say more to her, but she just thanked him and hurriedly went inside. Next, Kangwoo went to his ex-lover's resting place. He placed the ring he had worn on her hand on her grave and told himself that he would live as a dead person, someone who was no longer important to Yun-son. Meanwhile, Yun-son hugged Dan's handkerchief and sobbed. Meanwhile, Dan looked up at the sky and wondered why fate only targeted him to cause such suffering. Why was Dan the only one who remembered everything? Then he jumped into the sea. The next day, Yun-son went to work and took Dan's handkerchief with her. Yumi found a new secretary for Yun-son, but she told Yumi to cancel it because Dan would come back. Yun-son said that she didn't know when Dan would come back, but Yun-son was willing to wait for Dan. Hearing that, Yumi was happy because Yun-son had regained her spirit. Meanwhile, Nina told Yun-son that she should be careful of everyone's prying eyes. They were thinking that Yun-son and Kangwoo had some kind of relationship because Kangwoo was determined to choose Yun-son as the female lead. That was the reason why everyone wanted to go on strike. At this time, Yun-son realized that Nina had feelings for Kangwoo, but Nina immediately denied it. Nina just said that she didn't want Yun-son to damage the company's reputation. Yun-son insisted that she had never done anything wrong to the company. At that moment, Kangwoo heard the whole story. Yun-son immediately asked Kangwoo not to let personal feelings interfere with work because there were rumors that two were dating, but Kangwoo replied that he couldn't do that. He then focused on instructing the dancers. Meanwhile, Nina went home and found her father waiting for her. Later, Ki-chan and Nina went out to eat. Ki-chan asked Nina not to overwork herself by competing with Yun-son. Nina thought that Yun-son was favored by the gods because she had everything that others wanted, such as beauty, wealth, and talent. But Ki-chan then added that if the gods were really good, they wouldn't have left Yun-son an orphan since she was young. Ki-chan asked Nina to take good care of Yun-son because he always wanted the two of them to get along. Meanwhile, Young-ja goes to Runa to ask her to bribe the dancers in the troupe. They target girls who are raising children alone or have to tutor to earn extra income. Of course, the main male dancer is also indispensable. Meanwhile, Yun-son is still practicing hard day and night. Yun-son wants to ask Yumi's opinion about a friend, but is actually talking about her own love affair with Dan. Yumi advises Yun-son not to worry about Dan, but Yun-son is still worried because she doesn't know where Dan is and if he is okay. At this time, Dan goes to the hospital where his father is dying. Dan is extremely angry because his father beat and abandoned him in the past, causing him to act in despair. When Dan's father hears this, he bursts into tears and apologizes to Dan. He takes all the blame on himself. Hearing this, Dan screams in pain and runs away. Soon after, Dan's father also passes away from shock. When Dan runs outside, he sees Hu standing there. Dan says that his father should have admitted his mistake earlier. Hu then explained that Dan's father had been very remorseful and had been quietly volunteering volunteering at the hospital for the past 13 years. 5 years ago, Dan's father had just started to get sick. Hearing this, Dan felt even more pain. Dan thought that his life had been too miserable, and his death was equally miserable. Dan remembered everything, but he couldn't tell Yun-sun. Dan decided to find out the truth himself. Before Dan left, he thanked Hu for taking care of him. Later, Dan drank alone and met Kang-woo. Kang-woo knew that Dan was an angel, so he asked Dan to disappear from Yun-sun's life. Kang-woo believed that Dan would never bring happiness to Yun-sun. This surprised Dan greatly. Meanwhile, the doctor called Yumi and warned that Young-ja would interfere with performance. At the same time, he told her to be careful. Just then, Ki-chan suddenly appeared, causing the doctor to panic. Ki-chan asked the doctor to give Nina a chance to shine. Also give him more time to deal with family matters. Dan went to Kang-woo's house to investigate, but was stopped by the guard at the gate, who transformed into Kang-woo to help Dan sneak into his house. Dan then searched everywhere and discovered the truth that Kang-woo loved Yun-sun just because she looked like the person he loved. At that moment, Kang-woo suddenly returned. Dan thought that Kang-woo and Yun-sun were destined, but it turned out that he was wrong. So Dan decided that he would not return to heaven but stay. Kang-woo warned that if Dan dared to love Yun-sun, he would be punished by the gods very painfully. Meanwhile, Yun-sun sat counting each flower petal, and she wondered if Dan would return. When she saw his figure from afar, she was very happy. Dan ran to Yun-sun and hugged her. He promised to stay by her side and love her no matter what. Immediately after that, the two shared a passionate kiss. The next morning, Yun-sun woke up very early and dressed beautifully and put on makeup. Seon calls Dan and asks him why he is so late. She teases him, making him think she wants to kiss her, so he chases her downstairs and holds her against the wall. When they are about to kiss, Yumi suddenly appears, causing them to quickly separate. Yumi says she wants to check the security camera at night because she heard the door open and suspects someone sneaked in. Dan and Yun-sun tell Yumi not to check. Yumi looks at them and sarcastically says that men who change often are not trustworthy. Dan then takes Yun-sun to work. On the way, she says that she listened to him and ate and slept well. When Dan sees the handkerchief he hung in her bag, he smiles happily. Yun-sun wants to know what Dan went to do, but he doesn't say anything. She is slightly worried that he might change, but he affirms that from now on he will always be by her side and will never abandon her. Kang-woo saw Dan and Yun-sun being affectionate and felt very jealous. Both Kang-woo and Dan remembered the conversation the day before. Kang-woo advised Dan to give up his love for humans, or he would be punished by turning into dust, but Dan did not agree. Dan said he was willing to sacrifice for love. Even if he died, he did not want to hide his past and present from the person he loved. Kang-woo just wanted Dan to keep quiet until the performance was over, but Dan sarcastically said that he was not the only one who cared about Yun-sun, so he did not need to remind me. Meanwhile, Hu remembered Kang-woo's warning to Hu not to ruin his plan, so Hu started investigating and seemed to have discovered some truth. Kang-woo was still trying his best to guide the dancers in practice. At the same time, the doctor was eating when Runa's subordinate secretly installed a recording device. Yumi was worried because she had to call for a long time to contact the doctor. They arranged to meet at a secret place. Hu was at the church when Kang-woo came to see him. Kang-woo came to continue to warn Hu and Dan not to try to hinder him. When Kang-woo was about to leave, Hu invited Kang-woo to stay and drink with him. Hu told Kang-woo to drink instead of praying to ease his heart. Hu knew that Kang-woo had experienced the human world alone, but Kang-woo told Hu to take care of Dan instead of interfering in his affairs. Everyone thought Kang-woo had succeeded in bringing Yun-sun back to the stage, but Kang-woo himself felt his heart getting heavier and heavier. Kang-woo did not understand why he had such a grudge against Dan. He only knew that he longed to be freed from this suffering. Meanwhile, Dan practiced hard to prepare to tell Yun-sun the whole truth about his life, but the more he practiced, the more difficult it was. Suddenly, Yun-sun called. Dan was surprised when he saw that Yun-sun had changed the nickname he had given her. The two then arranged to meet. Yun-sun wanted to know what Dan was hiding from her. She guessed that he was terminally ill or had a family, but Dan denied it. He just said that he didn't want to bother her on the upcoming big day because she was preparing for her performance. Yun-sun didn't care because she just wanted to know the truth. Dan finally confessed that he had gone to see his father, but he didn't have time to talk before he died. Dan was in pain because he didn't understand why his father always treated him so harshly, even though they were father and son. Only at the last moment did his father apologize to him. Hearing that, Yun-sun immediately hugged Dan and comforted him. For the first time, Dan felt so warm. At the same time, Kang-woo overheard the female dancers gossiping. Kang-woo began to suspect that Runa had secretly bribed them. Kang-woo immediately went to find Runa to ask for clarification, but Runa did not admit it and even challenged him to go public with the media. Kang-woo was angry and thought that Runa and her mother were just greedy for power and money. They were always looking for ways to take over Yun-sun's capital company. Runa laughed and warned Kang-woo not to slander her family. otherwise, Kang Woo would have to pay the price. At this time, Yumi and the doctor secretly went to meet a man named Chin Un. It was Chin Un who was ordered by Young Ja to harm Yun Son and cause her to go blind. Now Chin Un wanted to testify to help Yun Son regain justice. However, the entire conversation was overheard. When the meeting ended, Yumi and the doctor made an appointment for Chin Un to get the recording and documents tomorrow as evidence to convict Young Ja. Immediately, the subordinate took a picture of their conversation and sent it to Runa. She began to plan to silence the witness. Meanwhile, Yun Son was still diligently practicing dancing. In addition, Dan was there to help Yun Son. Yumi walks in and encourages Yun Son to win tomorrow's vote. At the same time, Yumi says she will bring Young Ja's crimes to light. Yun Son then invites Dan to practice dancing together, but in reality, she wants to watch the stars with him. They walk hand in hand under the sparkling sky. Dan expresses his thoughts about the work Yun Son will perform in the audition, which gives her more inspiration and new ideas. They both run home to test the idea. Suddenly, Hu appears, looking for Dan. Hu asks about the handkerchief, but Dan just tries to avoid it. Hu advises Dan to give up his love for Yun Son before it's too late. Hu knows clearly that Kang Woo really likes Yun Son. Hu warns Dan that if he persists, he will be turned into dust. Hu hopes that Dan will return to heaven with him and continue to bring happiness to humans like before. However, Dan firmly refuses. Dan affirms that he wants to become human. Dan wanted to be with Yun Son. Despite Hu's warning, Dan's stubborn attitude made Hu even angrier. The next day, Dan took Yun Son to the audition. He was more worried about her than himself. Before going on stage, Yun Son asked to borrow Dan's handkerchief. Dan gave it to Yun Son and said that from now on he would always be by her side. He wanted her to keep it as a promise forever. When everyone was in the auditorium, Kang Woo entered the side stage. He encouraged everyone to do their best to be recognized. Only, Nina was not there with them at this time. While waiting, Yun Son discovered a dancer who was abusing painkillers because she had pelvic inflammatory disease. Yun Son advised her to give up the audition to take care of her health, but she didn't want to, because if she gave up, it would be very difficult for her to return to the stage. Right after that, the official audition began. In another corner, Young-ga and Runa are discussing a plan to rig the votes because they are afraid that Yun Son will win. Next was Nina's performance. Nina's appearance surprised everyone because of her outstanding charisma. Nina had once sought advice from her old teacher. It was thanks to her guidance that she shined today. The entire audience praised Nina, including Yun Son. However, Nina insisted that she did not perform just to be recognized by Yun Son. When it was Yun Son's turn, she performed with all her heart. Her brilliant performance made the entire hall admire Yun Son's talent. Dan could not hide his pride either. He praised her as wonderful. When voting, the results showed that Yun Son and Nina had the same number of votes. The organizers planned to have the two compete in a side competition to determine the winner. At that moment, Kang Woo remembered that there was still one dancer who had not voted yet. He called her over to give the final vote. The entire audience held their breath in anticipation. The final result was Yun Son's victory. Everyone happily congratulated Yun Son. Only Young Ja, Runa, and Nina were angry and sad. Young Ja was furious, but Ki-chan thought the result was fair because no one could deny Yun Son's talent. Ki-chan also knew that Young Ja had bribed the staff to let Nina win. Meanwhile, Runa went to find Nina and found her crying in the bathroom. Nina bitterly exclaimed that she wanted Yun Son to die. Because she loved Nina, Runa began to plot to harm Yun Son. After the audition, Kang Woo congratulated Yun Son and asked her out to express his feelings, but Yun Son refused and said that she only wanted to see him for work. Kang Woo was still determined, and he secretly told himself that he would wait until she agreed. At the same time, Dan also congratulated Yun Son and hugged her, but Yun Son was not happy. She blamed him for not giving her anything to congratulate her. After that, Yun Son immediately went to find Yumi. Dan promised that he would tell Yun Son everything. Later, that evening, Kang Woo went to the restaurant and waited for Yun Son. He hoped she would come. Meanwhile, Yun Son told Dan that Kang Woo had asked her out at a restaurant, but she refused. Hearing that, Dan couldn't hide her jealousy. Yun Son saw Dan being jealous and found him adorable. Yun Son laughed happily. The sky started to rain. Dan was worried and was about to go buy an umbrella. Yun Son curiously asked why Dan was so afraid of the rain. Dan just replied that he would tell Yun Son later. Then he hurriedly went to buy an umbrella. At the same time, Dan told Yun Son to wait for him to come back. But when Dan returned, he panicked because he couldn't find Yun Son anymore. At the same time, Yumi was also worried. Yumi stood at the police station waiting for Yun Son to come, but she still didn't see Yun Son. Later, the police found the body of the man who had harmed Yun Son and left her blind. At that moment, Kang Woo received a text message from Yun Son. Yun Son said that she was gradually losing confidence on stage, so she wanted to die. Dan panicked and rushed to find Yun Son. Meanwhile, Yun Son was captured by Runa's men. They blindfolded and tied Yun Son to a lamppost on the rooftop of the Fantinia Theater. Yun Son was extremely panicked. Runa ordered her subordinates subordinates to quickly prepare to kill Yeon-sun. Kang-woo immediately called Dan to report the situation. Kang-woo hoped that Dan would quickly come to save Yeon-sun. On the rooftop, Yeon-sun tried to negotiate with Runa's subordinates. Yeon-sun said that if he agreed to leave, she would not pursue the case. He immediately removed her blindfold and rope. She thought he had let her go, so she thanked him, but it turned out that he had untied her because no one who wanted to die would be blindfolded and tied. He then pushed Yeon-sun from above. At that dangerous moment, Dan managed to spread his wings to fly over and save her. Yeon-sun was extremely surprised when she saw Dan's wings. Dan hugged Yeon-sun tightly, trembling because he was lucky to save her from the hands of death. Kang-woo also arrived soon after. When Kang-woo saw that Yeon-sun was safe, he breathed a sigh of relief. When the police arrived at the scene, they heard that someone had jumped from the building. The subordinate from afar observed to see if there was anybody, but he did not see anything. He immediately reported the situation to Runa. She was surprised because they did not see Yeon-sun's body. Meanwhile, Dan took Yeon-sun home to rest. That night, Yeon-sun had a nightmare that made Dan extremely worried. Dan held Yeon-sun's hand gently to soothe her fear and lay next to her so she could sleep peacefully. But the subordinate did not give up yet. He went to Yeon-sun's house to harm her, but Dan sensed it, so he opened the door to check, but the person had already run away. At this time, Kang-woo went to see Runa to investigate the situation. He was sarcastic because he saw her face full of joy, as if she had just done something. Runa immediately denied it and lied that she was happy for Nina's performance. Kang-woo didn't believe it. He showed her Yeon-sun's desperate message. At the same time, Kang-woo thought that Young-ja was the one behind it all. He angrily scolded the two of them as greedy and shameless people. Runa pretended to be worried and asked Kang-woo if Yeon-sun was alive or dead. Kang-woo immediately became suspicious because he had never told Runa anything about Yeon-sun almost dying. Kang-woo's words startled Runa. Meanwhile, had disguised himself as Runa and told her subordinates not to act stupidly. Who warned that if others knew that Yeon-sun was killed, they would be finished. Who immediately returned to the church and asked God for mercy and forgiveness for them. The next day, Yeon-sun woke up to Dan's worry. He asked her if she was okay. She replied that she was okay and that she didn't remember what happened. He breathed a sigh of relief. Only then did Yeon-sun remember that she had missed the appointment with Yumi. When Yeon-sun went to the bathroom, she found a deep mark on her hand, which was confusing. Yumi and Dan had arranged many bodyguards to protect Yeon-sun and tightened security around the house. But Yeon-sun thought it was unnecessary. Yumi was still determined because she didn't want the same thing to happen again. The only thing Yeon-sun remembered was when she was waiting for Dan to buy an umbrella. After that, she suddenly fainted and couldn't remember anything else. This surprised Dan. Meanwhile, Young-ja was worried about Nina because she cried all night when she didn't get the main role. Runa scolded her mother for not being able to protect her. Nina thought that a mother's duty was to protect her child. Runa insisted that Nina would definitely shine. At this time, Dan didn't want Yeon-sun to go to work because he was worried about her safety and health. Yeon-sun said that she was fine. She could walk by herself, but Dan was still determined to keep Yeon-sun. Because she was in Dan's arms, Yeon-sun suddenly felt warm. When Kang-woo called Yeon-sun, Dan picked up. Kang-woo asked about Yeon-sun's health and announced that today's practice would be cancelled because he wanted to investigate what happened last night to see who was behind the harm to her. However, Yeon-sun said that she just fainted and that she had asked her secretary to inform Kang-woo. Then Yeon-sun said that she wanted to find Dan's handkerchief because she had lost it. Dan promised that he would find it for Yeon-sun so that she could rest assured. Then Dan went to the place where Yeon-sun had fallen and was angry. He was determined to find out who was behind this. Kang-woo went to see Young-ja and Runa and showed them Yeon-sun's messages. Young-ja was very surprised while Runa felt uncomfortable when Kang-woo kept accusing them of harming Yeon-sun. Kang-woo affirmed that he would find evidence. Kang-woo threatened them that if they harm Yeon-sun again, he would absolutely not let it go. Just then, Nina entered. Kang-woo used Nina as a hostage to threaten Young-ja and Runa, making them both extremely worried and scared. Meanwhile, Who used magic to bring Dan to the church. Who wanted Dan to stop before things went too far. Dan thought that Who had used magic to erase Yeon-sun's memory, so he was very angry. Who explained that if Dan had not spread his wings in front of humans, he would not have had to do so. Dan affirmed that he wanted to tell Yeon-sun the truth because he did not want to live in cowardice and fear. Who warned that Dan's love for Yeon-sun could cause her to be killed by others. Dan replied that if that happened, he would save Yeon-sun because it was an angel's duty to save people. Who was angry that Dan dared to think about interfering with human life. Who advised Dan not to be too greedy. Later, when Dan entered the room, he did not see Yeon-sun. He panicked and looked around for her. He then saw that she left a note saying that she was going to practice. He then breathed a sigh of relief. At the theater, Yeon-sun met Young-ja and Runa. They pretended to congratulate her on winning the female lead role. Yeon-sun wanted to know if they cared about the health of the dancers. Runa pretended to answer that she always put that first when running the theater. Runa then pretended to ask if Yeon-sun was okay. Yeon-sun said she was fine. Runa then angrily called her subordinate and blamed him for Yeon-sun being alive. He replied that Runa had told him to spare Yeon-sun, but Runa insisted that she had never said that. Runa began to worry that someone else knew her subordinate's face. Youngja was standing in a corner and heard the whole conversation. Youngja couldn't believe that her daughter would do such a terrible thing. Meanwhile, Dan went to Yeon-sun's workplace. He was worried about her health and wanted her to rest, but she refused. Dan said he would wait until Yeon-sun finished practicing so she could rest assured. Elsewhere, Kang-woo thought that Yeon-sun's inability to remember what happened was the work of an angel. He said that he hated angels because they always turned everything around. Dan advised Kang-woo to be careful. At the same time, Dan wanted to know why Kang-woo hated angels so much, but Kang-woo did not answer. Dan then asked Kang-woo to protect Yeon-sun when he was not here, because Dan thought that this place was no different from a tiger's den. Yeon-sun could be in danger at any time. While everyone was preparing to change into costumes for practice, Nina suddenly refused the role that Kang-woo gave her. Nina insisted on practicing the movements of the character that Yeon-sun played. She considered herself a stunt double. Kang-woo asked Nina why she did such a stupid thing. Nina replied that she wanted to be the female lead. Nina was disappointed because, even though Kang-woo praised her, he still did not choose her for the main role. Kang-woo thinks Nina is not perfect enough to take on that role. Meanwhile, Youngja sees Dan at the theater and is very surprised. Dan coldly says that Youngja is not worthy of being human because she harmed Yeon-sun, even though Yeon-sun is her family. While they are talking, Dan suddenly sees a suspicious person that he has met before. Dan immediately chases after him and knocks him down to ask him what happened, but he pretends not to know who Yeon-sun is. Suddenly, a maintenance worker recognizes this person as his colleague. Thanks to that, he is protected by other employees. They say he is a good person. At the same time, he confirms that he has an alibi to prove his innocence. He also hopes that Dan will soon find the real culprit. After Dan apologizes to the suspicious person, he leaves immediately. At this time, Runa is extremely panicked when he sees his subordinate appear at the company. He wants to know if Yeon-sun recognizes him or not. Runa nods in agreement. However, Dan was standing nearby and heard the whole conversation. Immediately after that, Dan followed Runa to the parking lot and stopped her. Dan asked why Runa harmed Yeon-sun. Runa pretended to deny the crime and said Dan was crazy. Dan criticized that Runa was actually evil under her beautiful appearance. He also threatened her that she was not allowed to harm Yeon-sun again. During this time, Yeon-sun finished practicing, but she did not see Dan. She thought that he was still angry with her. At that moment, Dan ran over and hugged Yeon-sun and said that she would not be alone anymore. Yeon-sun felt that something must have happened for Dan to act like that. Dan temporarily put aside the story he was going to tell and turned to write a work report. Dan told Yumi that he had found out that the culprit who harmed Yeon-sun was Runa, but Dan still had no evidence. Yumi regretted that she had ignored her suspicions of Runa before. Then Yumi received a call from the police. The police said they found Yumi's business card in Chin-eun's pocket. Yumi was heartbroken when she learned that he had been murdered, but she couldn't do anything because she had no evidence. Meanwhile, Yeon-sun began to suspect that Dan was hiding something. She pretended to ask him to clean the gym and sneaked into his room to find out what he was hiding. When she found out that he lied about losing his phone, she was furious. Dan tried to explain, but Yeon-sun didn't want to listen. She felt that she couldn't trust him at the moment. At that moment, Kang-woo called Dan to make an appointment. Kang-woo also suspected that Runa had harmed Yeon-sun, so he was willing to help Dan investigate. Kang-woo even asserted that if necessary to protect Yeon-sun, he would kill. Dan advised Kang-woo not to do so. Kang-woo replied that he wasn't an angel like Dan, so he wasn't afraid. Dan was curious to know when and how Kang-woo became human. Yeon-sun suddenly came out and wanted to know what the two were talking about. Because Yeon-sun was still angry with Dan, she left and got in the car with Kang-woo. On the way, Kang-woo said that Yeon-sun was exactly like the girl he used to love. He was blinded by love, but now he didn't want to do that again. Then Yeon-sun called Dan and asked him to tell her what he was hiding. Dan promised that he would tell her when they met. Yeon-sun went to find out the truth herself. The balloon seller told Yeon-sun that when Dan went to buy balloons that day, he couldn't find her. He panicked and screamed her name. Yeon-sun learned that she had gone missing that day, and Dan panicked and went looking for her. Finally, Yeon-sun remembered the whole thing. She was knocked unconscious, blindfolded, and kidnapped to the roof of the theater. Then she was pushed down from a high place. Dan flew to save Yeon-sun. When she met Dan again, Yeon-sun asked him if he was an angel. Dan was confused and didn't know how to answer. Yeon-sun continued to piece together her memories and confirm the truth. Yeon-sun couldn't believe that Dan was an angel. Yeon-sun was angry with Dan for hiding it from her. Dan explained that he really wanted to tell Yeon-sun, but he he didn't want her to be scared when she remembered being kidnapped and almost dying. Yunson protested that it was just an excuse. Dan should have told Yunson the truth when they first met, or at least when he saved her from free fall, but Dan chose to hide it. Dan confessed that he didn't dare to tell her at that time because he thought Yunson wouldn't believe him and would even be disgusted when she found out that he was an angel. On the contrary, Yunson insisted that she didn't find angels scary. Whether Dan was a devil or anything else, Yunson didn't care, because Yunson loved and trusted Dan very much, but he disappointed her, so she left in a huff. Dan immediately ran after Yunson and held her hand, but she pushed him away. His hand accidentally touched a tree and bled. Yunson asked Dan if he was okay, but he hid it. She pulled his hand away and was shocked to see that the wound healed immediately. Dan explained that because he was an angel, this was normal. Yunson didn't want Dan to follow her, but Dan was so worried about Yunson that he went crazy when he found out that someone wanted to harm her. Yunson told Dan to stay away from her. This confused him. She was still angry with him, even though he revealed his true identity. When she saw Dan entering the room, Yunson yelled at him. Dan was still worried about Yunson, because now she remembered what happened when she was kidnapped. He told her to rest assured because he would always be by her side. Yunson then wanted Dan to take her to the church, but Yunson realized that Hu was turning into a nun to trick her. Yunson threatened Hu, making him scared. She wanted to go inside to find out everything. Even though they tried to hide it, Yunson saw through it. Yunson was very angry because Hu had lied to her. Hu stopped Yunson from finding Dan and made her live in torment. Yunson ordered Hu not to do that again, or she would not let it go. When Yunson wanted to know Dan's real mission, she was angry because his mission was to pair her up with someone else, specifically with Kang Wu. Dan apologized to Yunson for what he did. Dan thought Kang Wu was Yunson's destiny, but he was wrong and regretted it. Yunson was angry with Dan and left. Meanwhile, Yongjia asked her husband what he wanted when he was old. He said he just wanted a peaceful life with his family. He didn't want wealth and glory. Then Yongjia went to Runa's room. Yongjia wanted to know who Runa sent to harm Yunson, and Yongjia also knew for sure that Runa was the one behind Singwon's accident. In contrast to Yongjia's fearful expression, Runa was completely calm and admitted her crime. Yongjia heard that and immediately asked Runa not to act rashly, but Runa only reassured Yongjia to rest assured and not to worry. Meanwhile, Yunsun was lying in the room when she received a call from Dan. He wanted to bring her chrysanthemum tea. He regretted letting her fall into the hands of someone else, but she told him to sleep. At the same time, Runa received a message from her subordinate. It was a recording of the conversation between Yumi and the doctor. Yumi said she would stop this incident because she knew that the person who suffered the most was still Yunsun. At the same time, Yumi told the doctor to be careful. As soon as Runa took off her headphones, Yumi quickly threw the doctor's phone away, surprising him. It turned out that a few days before, Dan and Yumi suspected that someone had intentionally installed a wiretap on the doctor's phone, so the bad guy knew all their actions. Yumi told the doctor that Chinun had been murdered. Before the doctor could calm down, he saw Yunsun. He also confessed that he had harmed her, but he was not the mastermind behind Chinun's death. Yunsun did not believe him, and she asked him to make amends by helping them find the mastermind behind everything. Dan saw that Yunsun was not well, so he told her to rest. Yunsun was heartbroken that they had harmed Song Hwan and caused him to die unjustly. She was determined to find the mastermind to avenge him. To help Yunsun relax, Dan took her to the fountain to watch the rainbow. Finally, he gave her the box she had given him when they were young. He told her that he was the boy she used to know, the one she had always dreamed of. Yunsun was moved and cried and left, making Dan think that she was angry with him. She cried and regretted not recognizing him sooner, but he comforted her and kissed her passionately. He seemed to want to say that he was with her now. Dan thought that his mission was not over. Yet, Dan wanted to find a way to become human so that he could be with Yunsun. So Dan went to Kangwoo to ask how to become human. Kangwoo advised Dan not to do anything stupid because he would only bring pain and regret. Dan told Kangwoo that he was also human. Kangwoo opposed Dan becoming human because it was extremely dangerous for both Dan and Yunsun. Dan sadly returned home. Dan was in pain when he remembered Kangwoo's words that the only way for him to become human was for Yunsun to die. Dan's heart ached when he thought he had to sacrifice love if he wanted to become human. Meanwhile, Nina went to work and realized that her co-workers were spying on her. She opened the closet and found an anonymous letter threatening her about the accident 3 years ago. Not long after, Yunsun met Nina and thought that Nina was wasting her talent when Nina just wanted to be her substitute. Hearing this, Nina reminded Yunsun to take care of Yunsun's own business. Yunsun immediately used the accident 3 years ago to threaten Nina. Yunsun warned Nina that it would not happen again. The female dancers then came to apologize to Yunsun for accepting Runa's bribe to harm her. They said they had returned the money to Runa. Yunsun was not angry. She just thought that her dance was not worth worth the price of ordinary material things. Before Yunson left, she did not forget to thank her coworker for confessing and advised a coworker to take care of his health. Those words also made the coworkers change their minds about Yunson. Because Yunson wanted to know more about Dan, she went to see Kangwoo and learned that Dan would turn to dust if he loved her. Kangwoo also explained that the gods were very jealous of humans, and he knew Dan well because Kangwoo had gone through such a period. Hu then met Kangwoo and thought that he was trying to destroy everything because he did not have Yunson's love. But Kangwoo insisted that he was just protecting Yunson the way Hu was protecting Dan. On this side, Nina was packing her bags and moving out of the house. Youngja begged Nina not to abandon her. Youngja said that she did it all for Nina, but Nina refused and thought that Youngja was only doing it for her own ambition. Nina didn't want Youngja to be an excuse for the crimes she had committed. When Nina went out the gate, she met Runa. Nina hoped that Runa wasn't involved in the crimes, but she was disappointed to know that both of them had done terrible things. Nina didn't ask them to do those things. Runa admitted that she did it, and she believed that only family could help Nina shine. Nina was sad when she realized that her joy when Yunson went blind earlier was thanks to her family. While Dan was doing his report, Yunson knocked on the door. It turned out that Yunson couldn't sleep, so she wanted to sleep with Dan. Although she was shy, Yunson told Dan to just work and not worry about her. But it was hard to concentrate with a man and a woman in the same room, so Dan dropped his work and lay down with Yunson. When Yunson touched Dan's heart, he said that his heart still beat like a human's. Then he hugged her. He thanks her for showing him her weakest moment. He hopes her performance tomorrow is a success. The next day, Yunson announces to the board of directors that Youngja will resign. Surprising everyone, Youngja is about to explain her resignation, but everyone suddenly receives a text message saying that it was Ki-chan who stopped Yunson from getting a cornea transplant. Everyone is shocked when Ki-chan hears that he was the one who caused the incident and was arrested by the police. Yunson calms everyone down and tells them to go home and rest assured that they will not lose their jobs. Runa then wants to talk to Yunson privately. Runa pretends to kneel down and begs Yunson to forgive her and her family, but Yunson refuses. Yunson wants Runa's family to pay for what they did. Yunson knows that Runa is behind all this. Hearing this, Runa immediately stands up and challenges her that she will not give up her ambition. In another development, Kangwoo remembers Dan's words that he will find a way to become human without killing Yunson. Dan believes that his meeting Kangwoo has a reason and is arranged by God. Suddenly, the dancers return to practice, making Kangwoo happy. His work spirit is also higher than ever. At this time, Yumi promises that she will try to solve everything thoroughly to end the incident. But Yumi is still worried about Yunson. When Youngja's whole family is being punished, Yumi knows that Yunson will be heartbroken because after all, Runa's family is Yunson's relative. At this time, Dan wants Yunson to show weakness to him. Unexpectedly, Yunson wants to take pictures, but she doesn't know how to pose because she went to Russia since she was little and doesn't have many friends. But Dan teases her that it's because of Yunson's personality that she doesn't have friends. After that, the two happily take pictures to keep memories. Suddenly, Yunson bursts into tears and tells Dan not to disappear. He was surprised when she found out. Dan promised that he would find a way to become human so that he could be with Yunson. Not long after, Yunson wanted to get married with Dan the next day because Dan didn't have much time left. That same day, Dan seriously proposed to Yumi. He knelt down and said that she was his lifeblood. He admitted that he hesitated and didn't propose to her sooner and regretted it. He hoped that she would agree. Hearing that, Yunson immediately agreed. Finally, Dan hugged Yumi and promised to make her happy. But then Dan remembered Hu's words that no matter how hard he tried to change, people's fates were destined to complete their life cycle. However, Dan went to the church and challenged the gods that he wasn't afraid of death or disappearance. He was only afraid of Yunson's suffering. Dan didn't believe that everything was predetermined and was determined to change in his own way. Dan then confessed to Yunson that he could not become human yet. He was afraid that it would affect her safety. Yunson did not care, and she was determined not to let Dan be lonely again. And the two shared a passionate kiss. The next day, they told Yumi about their marriage. Yumi thought they were joking, but when she found out they were serious, she was both surprised and worried. Yumi did not agree because she thought Dan had nothing to bring happiness to Yunson. Seon was angry and said that she would go against the whole world to marry Dan, which made Yumi panic. Yumi loved Dan because he was kind, but she was more worried about Yunson because she was afraid that Yunson would be abandoned. Yunson hoped that Yumi would believe in her decision. Meanwhile, Kangwoo remembered what Nina said and felt tormented. But at this time, Nina was going to see her teacher to pay her wages. At the same time, Nina announced her decision to give up her passion for ballet. Hearing that, the teacher chased after Nina and wanted her to continue her role as a stand-in. At this time, Kangwoo found Nina, he scolded the teacher for showing Nina the wrong path of passion. But Nina was tormented by her family's crimes, so she didn't want to continue ballet. But Kangwoo hoped Nina would give him a chance to admire her true talent. At this time, Runa was not arrested because the court thought that more evidence was needed to convict her. Later, Dan and Yeon-seon went shopping together to prepare for the upcoming wedding. Who deliberately tried to approach them under different identities to separate them. Dan couldn't stand it and warned Who that he didn't want Who to interfere, but Who didn't want Dan to fall deeper into sin. If Who couldn't convince Dan, he would switch to convincing Yeon-seon. Hearing that, Dan still insisted that Who let him handle it himself. Meanwhile, Yeon-seon saw Who pinning Dan to the ground, so she angrily shouted that Who wasn't allowed to hit Dan, otherwise she will intervene. Yeon-seon also wanted Who to agree to Dan and her marriage, but Who coldly replied that there would be no blessing and left. However, Yeon-seon was still sad because she had no one to invite to her wedding, but Dan prepared a surprise gift for Yeon-seon to make her happy again. At the same time, Young-ja and Ki-cheon were being interrogated to get their statements. They both knew that Runa was the one who committed the crime, but they took the blame for Runa and covered for her. They knew they shouldn't have done that, but as parents, they had to protect their child. Ki-cheon admitted his guilt and thought that he wouldn't be able to live peacefully for the rest of his life. At this time, Dan went to see Runa. Surprising her, Dan warned Runa not to harm Yeon-seon. Runa thought that Dan was supernatural because he saved Yeon-seon when she fell from a high place. At the same time, Runa didn't want to stop case because she believed that evil people are always faster than good people. When Dan saw Runa's crazy personality, he fiercely threatened that if she continued to harm Yeon-seon, he would kill her. Meanwhile, many tickets for the upcoming performance were refunded, causing the theater to fall into difficulty. Yeon-seon decided to do an exclusive interview with the press. She promised to bring a new perspective on a familiar character to ballet lovers. Kangwoo thought this was a great idea to calm public opinion during the tense time. Yeon-seon then sent Kangwoo a wedding invitation. He was angry at her stubbornness. He hoped she would come to her senses, but Yeon-seon still insisted on marrying Dan no matter what. Yeon-seon thought that Kangwoo did not understand love. The person she loved sacrificed himself for her, while Kangwoo was only tormented because he thought her death was an unforgettable pain. Yeon-seon then ran to Who to ask how to save Dan from disappearing. Who was upset because Yeon-seon barged in, but Yeon-seon is determined that she will do anything to save Dan, even give up everything. Yeon-seon is heartbroken when she learns that Dan was punished for saving her in a car accident. Yeon-seon thinks she is the reason why Dan is in danger. This makes her depressed. Meanwhile, Young-ja and her husband have been released due to lack of evidence. But Nina still decides to leave her family. She thinks that she is the reason why everyone is suffering. Runa also wants to leave her family to find peace for herself and protect Nina in her own way. Meanwhile, Dan and Yeon-seon prepare for their wedding and write their vows. Yeon-seon wants to have many children, a son like her and a daughter like him. Dan worries that her son will have the same personality as Yeon-seon. She teases him but is still happy. Dan and Yeon-seon also visit the resting place of her parents and uncle. Yeon-seon introduces Dan as her husband. She thanks her parents for bringing him to her. Dan replied that he lived for her and he hoped that when he was gone, they would take good care of her so that she would always be happy. Yeon-seon heard that and got angry with Dan and left. She said that she wanted a divorce. Dan just hoped that when he turned into dust, Yeon-seon would still be happy and beautiful. She affirmed that she hoped that they would both live, and they promised each other that they would work hard together. Runa went to see another subordinate. She gave him money and ordered him to do as she wished. When Dan and Kangwoo found out, Dan handed the henchman over to Kangwoo. Dan would deal with Runa. Kangwoo was worried that Dan might kill someone, so Kangwoo advised him not to interfere with human life. Dan hoped the killer was not Kangwoo. At the same time, Dan told Kangwoo to stay by Yeon-seon's side and take care of her when he was gone. At this time, Nina went to see Yeon-seon to inform her that she had resigned, but Yeon-seon wanted Nina to stay as a substitute because that was the best choice. Nina finally agreed and the two began practicing. When Yeon-seon got off work, Dan hugged her and said he wanted to see her perform. The next day, Yumi was busy preparing for Yeon-seon and Dan's wedding. While Dan was nervous, Who suddenly brought a cake to congratulate him, which moved him. Yeon-seon was beautiful in a wedding dress. Then the two read the vows and kissed passionately. Then Dan kissed Yeon-seon and said he was going somewhere. Yeon-seon was worried. She went to the church to express her resentment to the gods. At this time, Dan went to see Runa and warned her not to do anything stupid to hurt Yeon-seon. Otherwise, she would be punished. When Dan rushed in, he strangled Runa, but he couldn't bear to kill her, so he let go. Suddenly, Runa's subordinate ambushed Dan. Dan rushed in to fight. In the chaos, Runa managed to run away. Dan intended to kill Runa's junior, but Who appeared in time and told him not to interfere with human life. But Dan wanted to kill all those who harmed Yeon-seon before he disappeared. When Who saw that Dan was about to be killed by Runa's subordinate, who cast a spell to kill him to save Dan. Dan was very confused and bewildered. It turned out that Hu loved Dan, and Dan made Hu change his mind. Hu wanted Dan to be himself. He would always be kind and loving. However, Hu was punished by the gods for killing people. Hu then turned into dust. In the last seconds of his life, Hu cast a spell to bring Dan to Yunson. Yunson was about to end her life with sleeping pills because she thought that this would save Dan, but Dan appeared in time to stop Yunson. He said that if she disappeared, he would not survive. However, Dan was stabbed so deeply that he passed out in Yunson's arms. She was worried and cried. She begged him not to die. Yunson did not know who did this to Dan. Soon after, Kang Woo arrives at the hospital, surprising Yunson. Kang Woo says that Dan is trying to eliminate Runa to protect Yunson. Kang Woo was very worried about both of them, and he thought they were stupid. Luckily, Yunson was fine. Yunson told Kang Woo that she wouldn't be performing because Dan only had a few days left, so she wanted to be by his side. Dan heard that Yunson wouldn't be performing, so he told her to live her own life and not worry about him, because if Yunson didn't perform, Dan's life would lose its meaning. Yunson was worried when she thought that Dan was doing it for her. Seon wanted that if only one person could live, it should be Dan, because Dan never lived a full life to enjoy happiness. Yunson was very afraid that Dan would disappear. Dan also didn't want Yunson to disappear like Hu. When Yunson asked about Hu, Dan cried even harder. The two went to the church and they saw Hu's final report. Dan made Hu change his mind and go against the God's will. Hu didn't regret what he did. He asked God to bless them. Dan and Yunson were very grateful to Hu for sacrificing himself so that they could live. They were determined to cherish the remaining time together. Runa was angry when she learned that her subordinate had been killed. At that moment, Nina called Runa. Nina wanted to see Runa and see if she was okay. However, as soon as Runa arrived, the police surrounded her and took her to the police station for her crimes. The evidence in the subordinate's phone ended everything. At the same time, Dan and Yumi wanted Seon to focus on the upcoming performance. Kang Woo also supported and wanted Yunson to perform. At the same time, Kang Woo supported Yunson's love for Dan. Dan wanted Yunson to perform for him so they could enjoy the remaining moments together. Yunson intended to write a report to beg God to let Dan live, but he said he had done it many times, but God did not agree. Yunson thought God was difficult to please. At this time, in her despair, Runa wanted to end up in prison, but then she was rushed to the emergency room in time. Yunson will perform tomorrow. Dan is happy because he has been waiting for this day for a long time. Yunson confided that ever since Dan gave her the handkerchief and told her to consider him as her friend, she started to like him. Then the two of them relived the moment when they first danced together to keep those beautiful memories. The next day, Yunson will perform the most anticipated performance. Everyone is busy preparing. Among them, the board members bring flowers to Seon. The chairman is eagerly waiting for the performance. He compliments Yunson for looking great in her ballet outfit. Yunson confidently declares that she will amaze everyone with her talent. Yunson will show him how wonderful this work is. Then Yunson introduces Dan to everyone as her husband. Then Dan wishes the performance a success that will impress and admire everyone. Before the performance, Kang Woo wants Yunson to say a few words. Yunson said she used to think she was perfect, but it was the gods who made Yunson realize that was wrong. She was happy to stand on stage again. Yunson would dance until she fell. She hoped that everyone would create great work together. Yumi heard that and cried and was happy for Yunson. Dan suddenly thanked Yumi. Dan thought that Yumi was Yunson's guardian angel. Dan asked Yumi to take good care of Yunson when he was not here. Yumi reminded Dan not to hurt Yunson. Otherwise, there would be a fight for him. Yunson asked Nina because she thought Nina might not be okay with helping the police arrest Runa. Nina said that evil should be punished appropriately. At the same time, Nina made peace with Yunson. Soon after, the police discovered that Runa had beaten up a hospital employee and escaped. Runa had pretended to be a nurse to escape from the hospital and then mixed into the performance under the name of a theater employee. As the show began and the audience was enjoying it attentively, Nina received a strange call. Nina discovered that Runa appeared at the show and plotted to harm Dan. If Dan was in danger, Yunson would be heartbroken at losing the person she loved. Nina reminded Runa to stay awake and confess, but Runa challenged Nina to call the police to arrest her. The performance was then a half success. Nina called Dan out to report Runa's plot to prevent anything. Runa stood nearby and heard everything. Yunson saw Nina was worried, so she asked about Nina. Dan congratulated Yunson for completing half of the play, but he suddenly received a call, so he temporarily left her. Yunson was about to go to the waiting room to rest when she unexpectedly met Runa, which made her panic. After that, everyone searched everywhere but couldn't find Yunson. Seeing that, Kang Woo quickly told Nina to replace Yunson to perform. At this time, Dan also found Runa. Immediately after that, Runa threw a knife to the ground and challenged Dan to kill her, but Dan didn't do it. Instead, he called the police to arrest her, Runa was still stubborn and said that Dan should have died, not Yunson. It turned out that Runa had intended to stab Dan, but Yunson had stopped her and she was stabbed deeply. Although Yunson was seriously injured, she still tried to return backstage with a purple face. Nina worriedly asked Yunson where she went, but Yunson only praised Nina for dancing her part very well. Although the wound was bleeding, Yunson was determined to continue performing to complete the act. Dan looked at Yunson and was worried when he saw that his wife was not okay. As soon as the performance ended, Yunson quickly went backstage. Yunson immediately collapsed in Dan's arms. Yunson was glad that Dan was not the dead person, and then she passed out. Dan immediately took Yunson to the emergency room. The doctor announced that Yunson's wound was very deep and infected because she ignored the pain to complete the work. Dan blankly watched Yunson enter the operating room. In his hand was a towel soaked in blood. Kangwoo was also present at the hospital. He was extremely worried about Yunson. At this time, Youngja and Kichon went to the police station when they heard that Runa stabbed Yunson. Both of them were extremely hurt that their daughter had become so cruel. Youngja felt sorry for Runa. She did not want her daughter to be tainted by crime, but Runa was still stubborn. She was blind and did not realize her mistake. Runa even wished Yunson would die. When Yunson still completed the performance in a dangerous situation, Runa was very surprised. The more Youngja listened, the more she lost her temper and slapped Runa. Youngja warned Runa to realize her sin, but Runa angrily said that Youngja had no right to slap her because Youngja herself had committed a crime. At this time, Dan was feeling regretful because he could not protect Yunson, causing her to fall into danger. Kangwoo comforted Dan and affirmed that Dan did his best to protect Yunson. Dan then gave his handkerchief to Kangwoo. Dan asks Kangwoo to give it to Yunson when she wakes up. Dan is sad that he can't be with Yunson right now. Kangwoo tells Dan to do it herself because it's not over yet. Because Yunson is in critical condition, the doctors have to use electric shock to revive her. At this time, Dan outside also gradually fades away. Fortunately, Yunson is out of danger. Kangwoo takes care of Yunson and admits that he lost to Dan. Kangwoo apologizes for being scared and liking Yunson too quickly. Kangwoo finally gives Dan's handkerchief to Yunson. Kangwoo says that Dan is sorry that he can't give it to Yunson directly. Kangwoo hopes that Yunson will quickly forget the pain of Dan leaving her. Soon after, Yumi tells Kangwoo to go back and focus on the upcoming show. He informs the press that the show will still go on. He reassures everyone who was worried that the show might be cancelled. Kangwoo wants Nina to replace Yunson in the performance, but she refuses. Nina was afraid that it would affect the reputation of the theater. Everyone also agreed that Nina should perform because she did nothing wrong. She called the police to arrest her sister. At this time, Youngja and her husband went to visit Yunson, but Yumi did not agree to let them in. They said that they had asked Dan's permission. Youngja had met Dan before to take all the blame on her, but he found her despicable because she did not fulfill her duty as a mother. She was the one who pushed her daughter into the path of crime. Then Youngja and her husband knelt down next to Yunson. They hoped that she would wake up and punish them. The two apologized for causing so many bad things to Yunson. Yumi felt heartbroken for Yunson. Yunson should be shining on stage right now, but she was unconscious. Runa was in jail and wanted to know about performance. Runa was happy that Nina was the female lead, but when Runa heard Kangwoo announce that Nina would never be able to stand on stage again because her family had committed crimes against so many people, Runa went crazy. Nina brought flowers and placed them outside Yunson's hospital room. Nina prayed for Yunson to wake up soon. Many days passed, but Yunson still hadn't recovered, making Yumi extremely heartbroken. Yumi was angry that Dan wasn't with Yunson at the moment. Kangwoo could only explain that Dan had something urgent to do, so he had to go far away. When Kangwoo saw the handkerchief on the table, he thought that Dan might still be alive. As expected, Dan was now with Yunson in his subconscious. The two went home together. Dan said that he thought he had disappeared, but God gave him a chance because he had completed the mission he was given. Even though he loved people, he should have been punished, but thanks to many prayers and his self-sacrifice, he controlled himself from killing. God forgave Dan and let him become an angel again. Yunsun was glad that Dan didn't disappear. Memories of the two of them planting trees, watching horror movies, and playing together suddenly came flooding back. He wished her happiness and the life she had always dreamed of. He promised to love her forever. After saying that, Dan kissed Yunsun on the lips and shed tears. The feather on the handkerchief also burned as a sacred sign. Yunsun woke up soon after. Yunsun burst into tears when she learned that Dan had left her. Yumi was overjoyed that Yunsun had woken up. 3 months later, Yunsun was elected president of the company. Yunsun announced to the press that she would carry out plans she had cherished for so long. She was ready to develop the company the way she wanted. Kangwoo was very worried about Yunsun because she had locked herself in her room for 3 months. He knew that said it was difficult to recover, but he hoped she would try. But Yun-sun always had a feeling that she would meet Dan again. But Kang-woo thought that it was almost impossible because the feather on the handkerchief was burned black. But Yun-sun thought that Kang-woo's handkerchief was also burned, but he was still alive. Kang-woo worries that if Dan returns, he may not be the same Dan as before. At this time, Youngja's family has been punished by the law except Nina. Runa is imprisoned for life for her crimes, but she does not repent. Yun-sun then visits Runa, surprising her. Runa thinks Yun-sun came to mock her, but Yun-sun realizes that Runa just wants to escape from her crimes foolishly. Yun-sun understands that Runa is selfish and only cares about herself. Yun-sun hopes that Runa will live the rest of her life here in solitude. Since Yun-sun recovered from her injury, she has been having hallucinations and seeing Dan next to her. Yumi is worried and asks the doctor to prescribe medicine for Yun-sun. At the same time, Yumi gives Yun-sun a box of memories of the two of them. In it are many letters written by Dan. Yun-sun is very touched when she sees Dan's mementos. At this time, Dan is very sad when the god shows him Yun-sun, but she does not see him. Sometime later, Kang-woo announced that he was going to America. Hearing that, Yun-sun thanked Kang-woo for helping her in the past. After that, everyone took a commemorative photo with Kang-woo before saying goodbye. Before Kang-woo left, he went to find Nina. Kang-woo encouraged Nina to quickly return to the stage. Hearing that, Nina said that she was very happy to be teaching dance to the children. Finally, Kang-woo promised that he would help Nina return to the stage whenever she wanted. At the same time, Yun-sun went to the place where she first met Dan. Yun-sun always felt that Dan was by her side. In fact, it was true. Yun-sun grabbed the leaf because she thought there would be a message from Dan, but there was nothing. At this time, Yun-sun's eyes were filled with tears because she missed Dan. Seeing that, he quickly raised his hand to wipe her tears. The strange thing was that Yun-sun felt Dan's hand. She thought it was just an illusion, so she touched him. The miraculous thing was that they actually saw each other. In the end, they hugged each other in happiness and emotion. The movie ends here. Thank you for watching. Goodbye and see you again.